And let's get ready to RPG!
RPG! RPG! RPG! RPG! RPG!
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Knights of Last Call. My name is Derek Melinda, and I'm really excited to be back. We took a couple of days off there. We were off last Thursday. We were off this Tuesday. I was on vacation in Las Vegas. We did go live very briefly in Las Vegas, and it was a complete disaster. Not for any of our faults, but because of spammers, trolls, and yes, Las Vegas security, which politely escorted me off of the casino floor. Needless to say, it was quite a moment. You may want to go check that in the VODs if you missed it. You might not get the exact right feeling of chaos that we had that particular evening. So welcome, everyone. Tonight, we are going to be, as usual, going with a topic that was voted on by the Knights of Last Call patrons. And we're going to just kind of, it's more of an exploratory space, but I really want to clean up some misconceptions and some misunderstandings that some people have about fiction-first gaming, or what is the fiction. Some people really dislike this idea, and I think it's because they completely have the wrong idea of what it means to be talking about the fiction or to have a game that cares about the fiction. And is that any different than, say, narrative, or when we talk about narrativist mechanics, like when we're talking about GNS scores? What does that mean? And how do those two things connect, and do they, what does that matter at all? And so I think it'll be a little bit more of an interesting philosophical question, if anything. I didn't update any of our tip goals from the last time that we were live when I was in studio with Bob and Aaron. I'm just going to keep them up. As a reminder, we only have probably 1 or 2 studio streams left before we have to stop and break it all down. So while we're sort of transitioning out of the studio, we're looking for maybe some direction on what we should be streaming about and talking about instead. And that's why we had some tip goals. See if you guys wanted us to play some video games and to really see me suffer due to that. So real quick, let me just go through here. Shout out to some patrons and some other folks who've shown up. Omniscia Toad is hype to be here. That's fantastic. Beowulf salty that Galaxies in Peril did not win. Beowulf, your time to shine will come here. Mark is here as well. Welcome, Mark. London says that we can't do the fiction shot game. It'll be too dangerous because someone will probably die. Mike is here. Hello, Mike. Good to see you. We've got KC. We've got the Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Mat. Callimachus is here. Kyle S. is here. Gossamer is here. Welcome. Hello, Gossamer. Sidon is here as well. GM Scott. Hello. Rocking his loyalty badge. Love to see it. Heavy Metal Mystics. Solana. Scott P. Welcome. Luke Duff bringing up the fact that, yes, someone, again, it was obviously a troll or a spammer, was offering me $2,000 if I would take off my pants. So, it was good stuff. Apparently, GM Scott has the receipts. Paladin Actual is here. Welcome, Paladin Actual. Rare that you can catch these. Your family's out for the night. Excellent. Awesome. Sail away. Hello, Roman. Awesome to see you. Ikamos and Ken. Hi, Derek, and hi, everyone. Well, hello to everybody. I just realized maybe a few minutes before we went live, but when I was in Las Vegas, a video got recommended to me. And, I was in Las Vegas. I was just, keeping track of if anybody messaged me or whatever on the YouTube program or platform. But I saw something that somebody had... Oh, hey. Oh, we have GM Scott with his 23-month loyalty badge. Member message saying, "Hey, Derek, pray tell, does someone even get a loyalty badge, Derek?" Well, that's a great question you asked, GM Scott. There's a bunch of different ways you can support us. We're small-time content creators. We're not full-time content creators. We talk about some pretty off the topic or pretty off the beaten path topics. And so we rely on the support of viewers like you. We're like the NPR of tabletop role-playing games. And there's a couple different ways to support us. And one is through our YouTube membership. And you can join our YouTube channel for, I think it's $6.99 a month. And that gets you access to some cool loyalty badges and some unique emojis, which I was trying to get people to vote on, and so that we could have more of them. But we still have to. A whiteboard emoji is definitely coming. But yeah, that's one way to support us, and we love that. Of course, my recommendation would be, if you can, join the Patreon. There's a link in the description below. Patreon will get you into our Discord, where you can get access to a huge community of amazing gamers who are playing games, talking about games. Just today, we had a new member who basically said, I kind of joined for Derek, but he sucks. No, he didn't say that, but he was basically like, I've been on a lot of Patreons, and people just joined so that they could maybe get a little bit of personal one-on-one time with the content creator. And this patron was like, I'm surprised to find that Derek's here all the time, but honestly, it's the community that is really the benefit, and I completely agree with him. So it was kind of cool to see that and read that. You watch the VOD, but you don't know if it was a blessing or a curse. You know what? It's probably a mixture of both there, Spider-Man. So when I was in Vegas, I got a video recommended to me on my feed, and I thought, oh, this will be so cool. And I was like, oh, when I get back, I want to watch this video live with the viewers and play along. It was some content creator. Now I don't remember who it is, but they had other content creators on. It was like a game show. And this content creator was asking them questions and basically asking them to identify if this rule, or I don't know, something, art maybe, I'm not 100% sure what it was either 0th edition, 1st edition, 2nd edition, 3rd edition, 4th edition, whatever, 5th edition, D&D. And I thought, oh man, that would have been a fun game show for me to be on. Obviously I wasn't. And I was like, but it would be fun. But I didn't get a chance to watch the video. And I was like, oh, I should watch it, but live, and see how I do, and see, how the community does as well. And so I thought that would be kind of fun. And I forgot about that until like literally 2 minutes or 3 minutes before I went live. And I was like, oh, right, I was going to go back and watch that video. So maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll do that maybe this weekend or something like that. I thought it would be pretty fun. Oh, okay. It's Questing Beast. All right, Ben Milton. That makes sense. I'm pretty sure I'm subscribed to him. So yeah, it was probably on my home feed. Oh, I know who he is. I just, I have a lot of, actually, I mean, I have a fair number of TTRPG YouTubers in my subscription, but mostly it's not. It's mostly science, woodworking, that kind of stuff. Yeah. It was lines from the rule book. Okay. So see, this is number one, I just want to play. I mean, I think that'd be fun. But number two, it's kind of like an opportunity for me to see how I stack up against maybe other content creators. And I'm completely have no reason to flex on this, but I'd like to think I should do better than the people than most people. Let's just put this. Okay. But again, Ben Milton, he's a clever guy, and I'm sure he probably, went for some duplicitous questions to kind of lead us astray. So, anyways, maybe that's something we can do later. I was just thinking about that as we were about to go live. Okay, well, and then as a reminder, if you have any questions or thoughts or comments while we're doing this is all about, one of the cool things about Knights of the Last Call here is we're not that big, and I read all your chat while we're playing, or while the stream is going. I got you right here in my teleprompter. So I, generally speaking, can read along and follow along with most of the chat. So it's about a conversation. It's about you asking questions. If you want to go ahead and throw it into a super chat or a tip, a Stream Elements tip, that's awesome. Love the support. And of course, obviously, we get to really show off your question in a really cool way. But in general, as things come up, let me know what your thoughts are, what your comments are, what your questions are, and we'll try to go from there. All right. So, the fiction. I'm sure the whiteboard will be coming out at some point here. So let's just really quickly start so that if the TLDR, a lot of people believe that when a game talks about the fiction, or when someone talks about a fiction first game, that what they are talking about are mechanics or a game or a way of playing that is pushing one might say railroading, a plot or narrative agenda. Okay? And that is not okay. That is not the case. And already I'm like, okay, I need to go to the whiteboard. Here we go. Okay. Whiteboard. Boom. There we go. Okay. I had it open. So fiction, okay? The fiction does not equal a narrative. So, I mean, these are all terms and definitions, but I think it's important to understand terms and definitions don't really matter. I mean, they do give us a nice, sort of a comprehensive language. They're sort of a Rosetta Stone so that we can talk about different ideas and different concepts from game to game and from system to system and from table to table. So they do have a value in sort of coming up with common definitions. But what I really hope that you get out of this stream is more importantly, that it is an understanding of why fiction-first mechanics have an advantage, or maybe not an advantage, but what are the pros and what are the cons of fiction-first fiction-first mechanics, and what does it mean to be a narrativist mechanics? So, the fiction, when we talk about the fiction, we do not mean a narrative. We also do not mean, by the way, this symbol means does not equal. We also do not mean, a story, a plot, okay, a preconceived idea. Okay, so none of these things mean the fiction in the context of the way that people have started to use TTRPGs. Now, why the name The Fiction really kind of got popularized, admittedly, by Apocalypse World and by Powered by the Apocalypse games that followed after it. And like many things in Apocalypse World and like many things that followed in the PBTA games that followed after it, it is not a great name. And I mean, it makes some amount of sense. And we've talked about this on previous Powered by the Apocalypse streams where I've said, like, calling them hits and misses is like really, really bad because that's not what a hit and a miss are in PBTA. So calling it The Fiction is bad because just like hit and miss have very preconceived notions for people who are coming from, say, a D20 based game where a hit equals something happens, I did the thing, I climbed the wall, I hit the monster, and a miss is a failure, right? And it means that I didn't do the thing. My attack did not land. I did not climb the wall. I did not pick the lock. But in PBTA, we know that is not what hits and misses mean or what they do. So the terminology is pretty bad. So the same thing is true with The Fiction. And that's because when we hear The Fiction, right, we're thinking about, like, where does your mind go? Your mind goes to, right, fictional writing, right? Fiction writing. It goes to the idea of, if you say someone's a fan of fiction, right? You mean like as opposed to nonfiction. Oh, they like made up stories. They like books. They like, right? Like that is where the fiction sort of fiction. Oh, geez, that's horrible. Right. Man, that's horrible. All right, hold on a second. Writing. Okay. So again, that's like one of those things where it's like the name gives people the wrong idea that it's this fiction writing. And that is not the case. So then what the hell is the fiction? So let's define this, okay? Because fiction-riction, yeah, exactly, Casey. It's the fiction-riction, fiction-ricton. So what is the fiction? Well, the reason that we call it the fiction is because it is made up, okay? It is the thing, it is artificially created. But what it isn't is someone's preconceived story or plot, okay? Simply put, what the fiction is, okay, the fiction is, you ready? the shared mental imagination of what's going on in the world of our game. Independent of mechanics. Okay. So, what is the fiction? The fiction is the shared mental imagination of what's going on in the world of our game, independent of any mechanics. So, what the hell does that mean? Well, simply put, what it means is, and we'll kind of, talk about this. When we sit down and we are describing things, the GM is describing things, the players are describing things, we're all sort of painting a mental picture. This is the sort of the hallmark, right, of role-playing games. In fact, I argue that it is this fiction. It is this shared, Full Metal Dragon calls it the shared mindscape, which I like. This sort of shared communal vision of what is going on is, in my mind, what role-playing really is. Again, not to get off sidetrack, but I don't think role-playing means talking in character. I don't even necessarily know that role-playing means that you are concerning yourself with, even, playing necessarily, quote unquote, how your character would play. I don't actually think that's what role-playing is. What I think differentiates role-playing games from, say, board games is that in a role-playing game, you are creating this shared space where we can all imagine somewhat the same thing. Obviously, none of us are going to be completely imagining the same things. But when I describe something, what I'm trying to do is get us all on the same page. Okay? And that page is called the fiction, right? So it's not some sort of like book writing agenda, it's not some sort of plot or sort of like predetermined outcome, all right? It's what happens when we focus just on our imagination and we don't worry about the mechanics of the game. We don't worry about what's on, what's a character sheet, what's pencils, erasers, dice. We are just focused on the shared communal experience. Now, in theory, right, you could just have that be a thing. In fact, communal storytelling has been a thing that's been around for a long time, where people sit together and they just tell stories and they all kind of try to build a world together, and there's no real plot. They're just doing it completely, just for the off the cuff. So the fiction is what is happening in our world. And Pumpkin says, I tend to call the fiction the world at times, referencing the shared fictional world or universe. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different layers, right, of the fiction. So, like, there's the idea, and I think that they both probably can be used at the same time, although, again, I would, always be cautious. So, like, the fiction can be, like, sort of, the world that you're building. But it can also, and this is the way I usually use it. I usually use it as, like, what is going on right now. So let me give you one of the best example that I can give about this. All right. We're playing a role-playing game. It doesn't matter which. All right. And you are a sprite character or a, fae character, or maybe you're like, an Aarakocra, right? You're a creature that has wings. Now, presumably, you have wings because you can fly. The world of the fiction would say you have wings, you should be able to fly. And a fiction-first way of approaching someone, a character, a race, having wings. Now remember, fiction first ignores the mechanics. We don't care that you're level 1. We don't care that flying will break the game. Okay? We don't care that it would be unbalanced if a character could fly because at that low level, because they could just get a ranged weapon and then they could just, kite everybody from, 30 feet up and everybody else would just be killed, right? None of that matters when we're talking about fiction first, okay? Because in fiction first, we are simply saying, hey, we all have, I'm describing to you this mental image, right, of this bird creature, right, with a very thin skeleton, and you can see how thin and hollow the bones are, and he has these broad orange feathers that come off of his large extended hands, which end in like bird-like talons. His face is humanoid, but it has bird-like features, including his nose and his mouth is really just kind of more of a pronounced beak, and right, we're describing a bird person. If we were doing that, forget that we're playing a role-playing game. Okay, forget it. If I was describing this, if I was telling this story to your kid, okay, on the playground, and I said, hey, do you think that this creature can fly? Everybody would say, yes, of course it can. It's a bird person. That's what bird people do. So having wings means you can fly, generally speaking. Now, granted, there's always exceptions for fictional first thing. You might say, well, they can't really fly, because they're too heavy. They can glide, though, for an extended period of time. And that might be fine as well. We're sort of, this is where, again, we can build up this idea of the world that you're building in, okay? That is fiction first. Fiction first means that what people are imagining takes precedence. Now, a mechanics first way of looking at this would say you can have wings, but flying is a very powerful game ability. And we are playing a game. And because we're playing a game, that game has rules. And because of the particular game that we're playing, those rules matter. And people want to be able to create a certain type of experience, a certain type of challenge, a certain type of play pattern. And as a result, you cannot fly. Not until you reach level 7 or reach level 15 or something like that. Or you can only fly, but for like 1 minute a day or something like that. All right. So that is a mechanics first. Now let me be very clear about something here, because this is where some people can get tripped up. Okay. We've got fiction first, which says if you have wings, right? Wings equal fly. Okay. And then we have mechanics first. And in mechanics first, it says, well, if you have wings, well, doesn't matter. Okay. You can't fly until level 7. And then you can fly. All right. So that's what mechanics first is. Now, here's the thing. Okay. Yeah. Kyle says fiction wings. You have wings and you can use them. Mechanical wings. You have them and they're aesthetic, right? And that's very true. Now, that being said, and this is important, people, generally speaking, okay, do like fiction. All right. They do like the world to make sense. And so what people will often do, and this is very true of a lot of different games, we're going to get here, don't worry, is that people will take a mechanics first approach. They'll say, yes, my character has wings. No, they cannot fly because they are level 1 or level 2. Now, for some people, that's enough. You don't even question it. You just don't even think about it, right? The same way that you don't question the fact that you can't, swing your sword hard unless you have power attack or if you have a great weapon fighter, right? You just go, hey, I'm that's not something I can do. Well, but for a lot of people, though, they want some more sort of an excuse than that. And so they accept that you cannot fly until you are level 7. And by the way, let's be very clear here. We're not talking about a lit RPG here. So, by and large, I think most of us would say that in our TTRPGs, people do not know what a level is. They don't understand that if I go and kill enough orcs or get enough treasure or incur enough milestone-based progression, or if I go and do 3 adventures, that like something biologically changing in my body that now allows me to fly. Like, no, most of us do not think that way. But what people will do is they will inform the fiction off of the mechanics. So they'll say, yes, my character has wings, but they can't fly yet. And the reason is because they're level 1. But it's like, well, why can't you fly? As Bob said, I need to get stronger. Right? And this is where kind of, the game can, I hate to say it, but it can fall apart a little bit because Bob isn't wrong here. Right? There's no particular reason why your character can suddenly fly at level 7. Now, some games will go really far into the tank. Right? They'll really want to explain it. And so they'll say that like, once you get to level 7, once you get to level 13, your character enters into a metamorphosis and you can spend a level appropriate amount of money and you can spend, you spend 3 days of downtime. And then when you emerge, your wings are stronger and then you can, fly around. Now that is jumping, in my opinion, through a lot of hoops. But it's something, right? I mean, we can go, okay. And you can say, so can I go do that ritual right now? And then it's kind of back to the mechanics first. It's like, well, no, you can't do it until you're level 7. Sorry. Or level 13 or whatever, or level 17 or whatever the case may be. Yes, level appropriate metamorphosis. Now, you could also do it in such a way where you say, well, look, it costs 10,000 gold. If you get 10,000 gold, you can do it. I don't care what level you are. And that might be a different way. That might be an interesting way to do it as well. But so fiction, now it should be very apparent, okay, that fiction first gaming has potential for problems, right? Because like we said before, flying is a very powerful ability. Not half, but a lot of the classic challenges of D&D, climbing over the castle wall, avoiding the pit trap, getting to the other side of the treacherous ravine are basically nullified by a character who can fly. And so there's always sort of an attempt to, sort of balance it and break it down. But the fact of the matter is, when you play with a fiction first mindset, you are basically saying, remember, the fiction, right, is the game. I don't know how do I put this. Okay, yeah, that's a good way to put it. The fiction first is, there we go. Fiction first is the world, and mechanics first is the game. And oftentimes you kind of need to pick like which one is taking precedence here. Now it shouldn't go without saying that a game like Pathfinder 2 is, and 5th edition D&D, are more mechanics first. They are games where you can create whatever fiction you want, but it kind of doesn't matter because at the end of the day, it is the mechanics that are going to sort of trump, that are going to win. And in a fiction first scenario, this is where, and again, a lot of people do this unconsciously without even knowing this. There is a classic Pathfinder 2 example, okay? There's a classic Pathfinder 2 example. There is a feat that is called, someone else having, I think it's called Demolition Charge. Okay? And if I got that wrong, let me know. But Demolition Charge is a feat that you can take. And what that feat lets you do is it lets you say there's a door, okay, that you were trying to get through, and it's locked, okay? And what Demolition Charge lets you do as a feat is it lets you strap up to 4 bombs to the door and then blow them up, remotely, I suppose would be the word I would use, and deal their damage to the door. Outside of that feat, okay, these bombs, these alchemist fires, these acid explosions, they don't do damage to objects. They can't. So I could have a whole wagon of alchemist fire and acid flasks and thunderstones. And in a mechanics first game where they say those things don't deal damage to objects, then it doesn't matter how many I throw. Additionally, Demolition Charge lets you put up to 4 of these bombs onto a door. And it doesn't really particularly care that you could totally put 7 or 8 or 10. It won't allow you. And the reason why it won't allow you is because if you could do this, it might, in theory, break the game. Furthermore, mechanics first games can also create what I call automated fictional responses. Okay? This is very common. Well, it's common in a lot of games, but it used to happen to me a lot in 4th edition D&D. But so Demolition Charge has another thing where, like I said, it lets you put up to 4 bombs on a door, and then it lets you remotely set them off from, I think, up to 30 feet away, right? Obviously, you don't want to be standing next to the door, right? I think you can also create like a little bit of trap, So the idea is that your character can set up 4 of these bombs onto a doorway. Maybe you're not blowing up the door. Maybe you're just leaving it. You're setting up a trap. Okay, you can put 4 of these bombs onto the doorway, and then you can, from up to 30 feet away, remotely trigger it. How are you triggering it? Guess what? Not only does the game not tell you, the game doesn't care. There's no requirement that be true in the fiction for it to be true in your game world. In other words, when I think about somebody setting off a bomb remotely, I'm imagining, well, in modern day terms, I'm thinking of somebody with a freaking remote, right? Or you're thinking of, somebody with like a Wile E. Coyote, plunger that's going to set off the dynamite. But there's nothing that this mechanic requires that does anything about needing that or doing any of this. And so the mechanic trumps the fiction. So in the fiction, you're like, how am I setting this thing off? And, a bunch of people might look around and go, I have no idea. And you're flipping into your book and you go, and what you'll do is you'll make up an excuse so that the fiction doesn't fall apart. So you'll say, oh, you probably totally have like some wire in your backpack and you like string it up to the couple of bombs and then you run it back. And then it's like, okay, well, what am I doing with the wire? Is it like a fuse? Am I lighting it? Do I need a light? And you're like, no, it's like kind of like it's like an electric discharge. And you're like, okay, so do I have like a battery? And it's like, yeah, sure. And it's like a switch. And none of this is on your character sheet. None of this is, maybe none of this even makes sense in the fiction of the game, but it's become true because it has to be true. Because now, granted, like I said, some players, that might be you, don't give a shit. They go, I don't care. I don't care how I'm setting it off or why I'm setting it off. I'm blowing up my bombs. And they're fine with that. They are mechanics first, and they don't need to excuse it in the fiction. But for a lot of people, what ends up happening is you kind of jump through hoops in order to make something make sense. All right? I'll give you another example. In 4th edition D&D, okay, there was a condition called marked. And when you became marked, or when an enemy became marked, it was the result of another character marking you. And if you were marked, you got a penalty to attack rolls if you targeted anybody except for the person who marked you. So the idea was that a fighter, right, could run up, to the orc or the goblin or the ogre and attack them, and that would mark the ogre. And so now the ogre, what are we thinking in the fiction? I know what you're thinking, right? You're thinking the fighter is getting in this ogre's face, right? This fighter is going toe-to-toe with the orc. And if that orc tries to make a move to attack the rogue or attack the cleric, man, the fighter is just interfering with him, and he's bashing him up and crushing into him with his shield, locking up his weapons. He's fucking up his attack. The orc gets a -2 or -3 penalty to his attack roll to attack the rogue or the cleric. But if he goes and he focuses on the fighter, right, then the fighter takes the full attack and doesn't have the penalty. Everybody goes, yeah, that's exactly right. That's awesome. This is not a problem. Okay, but here's the problem. Mechanics come first in 4th edition. So my fighter could attack the ogre, all right, and then move 30 feet away and go around a corner and go through a door. I could go through the door and close the door, because closing a door is a minor action in 4th edition. So standard action, I attack the ogre. That marks it. He will now have a -2 penalty to attack anyone other than me. I will then move away from the ogre 30 feet through this door. And then as a minor action, I will close the door. Guess what? That ogre, that orc, is still marked and will be marked until the fighter's turn again, right? And so in that room that my fighter is no longer even standing in and is on the other side of the door, if that ogre walks over to the wizard and swings at the wizard, the ogre will have a -2 penalty to attack roll, because the mechanics say that they must. And we fictionally, I think we can all agree, doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now, what Solana is saying is what people end up usually trying to do in these situations is they back their way into explaining what happened. Oh yeah, the fighter really got under the ogre's skin, or he really created some sort of devastating counter that messed him up, tripped him up. He's dazed, he's dazzled, or something like that. But again, we are pulling at straws here, right? Because to be clear, in 4th edition, the fighter could miss their attack, and the ogre would still become marked. So even if the fighter didn't connect, it was like, oh, well, they're still somehow dazed from the blow from the fighter. It doesn't really make sense. And it never will. Now, that is what a mechanics first approach is. All right. And what Hides His Eyes is saying is somewhat true. I think people, again, I'm a fan of 4th edition. And I don't think that necessarily means you can't create interesting fictional situations with 4th edition D&D. But, I do agree to a certain extent that you are playing the game for its own sake. And again, there are reasons why mechanics first games are awesome. And one of the reasons why they're awesome is because they typically make, wait for it, ready? They make better games. I know this might sound crazy, but role-playing games are games, okay? And by and large, when people play games, those games typically have rules, and there's some in sense of balance and fairness, whether it's between the other players. There's not many people who would sit down to play a game of Monopoly and, you just go, well, that person starts with 17 properties and $10,000, but you start with nothing. And you'd be like, okay, well, this is a pretty shitty game. It doesn't seem really fair or balanced. So there's a huge advantage to having mechanics first games because, number one, it creates a level, balanced playing field for everybody. Number two, pause, hold on a second. I'm going to open up a window. Number two, and this is honestly kind of true. This is the sad truth. There is a reason why games have moved more towards mechanics first. Okay, the reason is because fiction first gaming requires two things. Fiction first gaming requires that the GM, and to a certain extent the players, are able to come up with new rulings, essentially, depending on how the situation in the fiction changes. So in other words, you need to be a little bit more, maybe you need to be a little bit more on your game, and you need to be a little bit more quick on your feet, and you need to be able to come up with new ideas and new concepts on the fly. And remember, that Jay says it requires a bit of imagination. Jay, yes. And I mean, that may sound like a kind of a derogatory thing that Jay's saying, but I don't necessarily think it is. There are some people who do not have very good imaginations. In fact, I didn't know this until I started an RPG channel, but there are people out there who are literally incapable of imagining things. It's crazy. But the real reason, that's part of the reason, but the real reason why people do not like fiction first and why people like mechanics first is, quite frankly, because they do not trust their GM, okay? Or the GM doesn't trust the player. Mechanics first gaming tends to be we've talked about this before, right? About what is the point of the game? Is the point of the game collaboration, okay? Or is it competition? Now, when you're playing a sport like football, right, you want the rules to be well understood, okay? One could argue that when people get really upset in sports, it's because the refs are sort of using fiction first rather than mechanics first rulings, right? They are, ideally, we would have this perfect sport that, whatever happened would be completely accurately decided on every single time. Tennis has this. Obviously, there's not as many rules in tennis because there's not as much going on as there would be in basketball or football. But in tennis, they have like a machine that just looks at the ball and says whether it's in or out. So it's very, very, very fair. And the fact of the matter is, there's for a lot of people, you want the protection of the law against your GM or your player, and you want to be able to know that I can do this thing, not because my GM says I'm allowed to do it, but because it's on my character sheet and because I can push this button and this thing will happen in the game. That is very, very common for a lot of people. Furthermore, there are a lot of players, okay, and there's a lot of, and this works from both ways, okay, players and GMs, who are looking for an experience where, the game just works. If a GM creates a scenario and they've gone and purchased an adventure, and then the players come up with this really clever idea that in the fiction would just completely destroy the adventure, then the GM can feel like they, kind of got cheated out of an experience. Similarly, if the GM rules, the players just fail because it doesn't even make any sense, right, in the fiction. Like, for example, imagine you were playing a Pathfinder 2 game with me, and you took this feat, Demolition Charge. And there's a doorway that that several trolls are about to come through. And you say, hey, can I set up my demolition charge in the doorway? And I say, absolutely, you can. You have 4 bombs, right? And he goes, yeah, I have 4 bombs. And he puts them up there and he goes, okay, I'm going to detonate them from 30 feet away. And I go, how are you doing that? Explain to me in the fiction how you're doing that. And the player goes, what do you mean? I don't know. Should I have something? Is it something that I should have in my equipment? I don't know. What's going on in your character sheet right there? That player is going to feel attacked, or that player is going to have a really feel bad moment because I'm suddenly putting this fictional emphasis on them to make their stupid feat work. And they're going to feel like I'm trying to, I don't know, come after them. I'm trying to, yuck their yum. And I think this happens a lot. And for whatever reason, okay, this has become very, very unpopular. Okay. And I know what people are saying, like, if the players don't trust the GM, then you have a lot of other problems. I really do think that the game has become strangely, where the players view the GM as potentially like not a force for evil. That's the wrong objective, but the players want to be insulated against the machinations of the GM. And a mechanics first game allows you to do that. We got a super chat from C-Cal. Calderic says, is free market a mechanics or narrativist game? It's a great question because, again, we're talking about mechanics first and fiction first, we have not talked about narrativist. And that is the other part of this whole exchange. So maybe we should talk about that a little bit. Okay? Because I want to be very clear about something here, okay? Fiction first does not equal a narrativist mechanic, okay? In fact, narrativist mechanics are oftentimes mechanics first. By definition, they're a narrative. So when we talk about fiction first, we ask what's true in the fiction, and then we go off of that. In other words, what is true with what's going on right now? And again, this is not rocket science here. It's like, well, you've strapped a bunch of bombs to a door. Okay, we all understand what that would look like if we can close our eyes, forget that we're playing a game. But mechanics don't just mean game mechanics. They can also be narrative mechanics. Okay? So the classic example of a narrative mechanic is from Fate. Right? And I'm going to give Fate a sort of a lifeline here, because Fate does make an effort to sort of say, okay, we should deal with the fiction first. But in Fate, you have the ability to spend a point to basically make the story better. Okay? So why is this different? Because fiction first means you know, and this is actually very surprising to people, okay? PBTA, okay, Blades in the Dark, don't actually really have any narrative mechanics. There is nothing in Apocalypse World, okay, to push it towards a certain type of outcome. The outcome that happens just comes from rolling dice. There's no idea that the GM or the player has the ability to alter the game through mechanical means. Now, of course, GMs can always alter the game. It's called fudging. What narrative mechanics do is they give players and they give GMs a way in the game system to make something interesting happen, because it feels like that would be more appropriate for, let's say, a 3-act structure, right? Of sort of a rising, a climax, and then a denouement, right? And we have this sort of 3-act structure. And the GM is like, okay, we're at this point. I want to start ratcheting up the tension, and I want to start adding a little bit more oomph to this encounter, or I want to make something more difficult, or I want to, this is suddenly, you know, the doors kick open and ninjas attack, right? I want to escalate. Now, a GM could just do that by fudging, but narrative mechanics are the idea of, well, we all signed up for the game to have this sort of story-like exposition, and so we are going to give the people the tools to use them, okay? And Jackal Torn Moon says Fabula points versus fear tokens. And Jackal Torn Moons is exactly right. Fabula points, and to a certain extent, Ultima points, are a fantastic example of a narrativist mechanic. In Fabula Ultima, your villain will have a pool of Ultima points. And if your villain is defeated, okay, they can basically use their Ultima, points, and they can I'll get you next time, gadget, and they can get away. Now, keep in mind that in a fiction-first game, we would say, okay, well, can they get away? How are they getting away? What's the methodology of how they're getting away? Right? We need to make it has to make sense in the fiction. But in a narrative mechanics-based game, we all agree that if the villain died right here, it would be really lame. And rather than just fudge, the game says, it's fine. The villain will spend 2 of their Ultima points, okay, and they'll get away. Now, as with most things in RPGs, even though that is a mechanics first decision, we as a GM, as a group, right, we will make something up in the fiction so that it works. So, for example, let's say that I've got a villain, and he's like, let's say she's like this really clever, devious, maybe not a red dragon, blue dragon, okay? and she's this hyper intelligent, super planning blue dragon, and she's the villain, and she's part of this arc, and the players have enjoyed going toe to toe with her. And they corner her in her, lair that she has built, deep in the desert in this ancient temple, and they're fighting her, and we're having a combat, and there's rules, and then the outcome of the combat is the players have quote unquote killed the blue dragon. But as a GM, I don't want that. My players they kind of don't really want that either, because they like that they have this villain, and they want a more appropriate, final confrontation. So my blue dragon goes ahead and spends 2 ultimate points so that it can escape. Now, Jackal Tormoon says it was a simulacrum the whole time. Well, Jackal, that might be a great example, okay, because blue dragons are masters of illusions. We all know this. I also might describe that the blue dragon falls back and breathes a massive bolt of lightning that shatters the ceiling or shatters the wall, and then the blue dragon, kind of flaps its wings once, hovers for a moment, stares down grimly and says, "I'll get you next time, Gadget," and then flies away. Now, you might say, man, that's a really powerful attack. Why didn't the blue dragon just use that breath weapon on the player? Well, no, because that's not a mechanic. Okay, we are just making up fiction to support the fact that I spent 2 ultimate points and my dragon gets to go away. Now, the fun of this is doing just that, is having to think creatively on your toes and, come up with something on the spot. Now, and by the way, some people really fucking hate this because it can be awkward, and it can be difficult, and it can be cringy, and people can come up with really, bad examples, or they'll literally just sit there and go, I don't know. I don't know how we get out, So that, I think, is where a narrative mechanic, and somebody else mentioned, the 2D20 system is another good example. 2D20 has threat and momentum, which are basically the same thing. It's a narrative mechanic. But so to say that a narrative mechanic is fiction first, it's not actually. A narrative mechanic is actually very mechanics first. You are creating something is happening because of the game system. And then we make up the story, the fiction, of why that happened or why that made sense. We had a couple super chats. Save versus. Most RPers that I've run into see the system as an efficiency puzzle. If there's many ways to make an invisibility spell, we'll work it out until we find the cheap, powerful version. Mechanics first systems do that for us. And I completely agree with you, Save versus. I think that games are fun, okay? I enjoy playing board games. Not so much video games, as we talked about last time, but I enjoy playing card games, Magic the Gathering, or even just like euchre. So there's clearly something very, very fun about engaging, as you say. It's an efficiency puzzle, or it's the people love building their character builds, because the idea is you want to see, how does this character stack up against the challenges that the game is throwing at me? And assuming that the game is throwing fair and balanced challenges at me, then how smart am I? How clever am I at using the system, okay, to run against it? And this is the fun of Magic the Gathering, right? People get to customize their decks, and then they get to run those decks out against other characters. Now, of course, you might say, okay, well, that guy has 5 Black Lotuses in his deck. Exactly, which is why we have, standard and modern and commander, and we have different versions of the game so that we can all be playing by relatively the same rules to make the game as fair as possible. Now, people enjoy that a lot. And when you sprinkle a little bit of, getting into the world and again, I've very rarely met someone who is completely only mechanics first. I mean, that is literally someone just playing a board game, where they have no interaction with the fiction at all. But there are plenty of people who really enjoy mechanics first games, what I would call board gamey style games, and then they make something funny. Everyone, they'll throw something and they'll be like, oh, yeah. When you hit the ogre, oh man, his armor, you cut through his armor and his pants fall off. Oh, and everyone's laughing and it's stupid and you're drunk and whatever. But you wouldn't do that in a board game. You wouldn't do that in a game of Magic the Gathering. But you might do that in a role-playing game. And you're playing a very mechanically heavy game, but you're still making some fiction out of it. So I don't know that most RPGers, but you're probably right that it's most. Hi, Eyes. says, I like fiction first play because I think the RPG medium is fundamentally reliant on subjective interpersonal communication. Any kind of perfect, predictable, comprehensive system is a wild goose chase. Well, yes, I mean, RPGs are definitely a exercise in communication, right? And the net result of the rule system is usually so that there are things that the game engine cares about that can interrupt and change the conversation that we're having. As you mentioned, it's subjective interpersonal communication. But eventually we get to a point in the game where we might not agree on that subjective interpersonal or that communication, right? I swing at the orc and I hit it and kill it. I don't know that you do, right? We're in disagreement about the nature of it. But more often it's that no one really knows what should happen here next. And that's where RPG, the game element, enters in, because the game says, I got you, fam. I'm going to give you a way to adjudicate the outcome in a way that is fair, random, and potentially, hopefully, leads to more exciting outcomes, because no one will truly know what happens. PBTA calls this philosophy playing to find out. And I think it is a very good one. So let's see here. A lot of conversation happening here today. Let's see. Mike D says, taking the demolition charge feat makes you magical since it changes the fundamental physics of the Galarian universe by allowing those bombs to affect objects. This is one of my favorite. I call it like mechanics apologetics. Okay. And it's where you have to take these mechanic first approaches and you have to take them to the most absurd version. And Mike's not wrong here, because in normal Pathfinder 2, all the bombs in the world, even if you're an alchemist, you could have tons of different bombs. They do not damage objects. They do not damage objects until you pick the demolition charge feat. And then 4 at a time, they can damage an object. And they even get to combine their damage to get through the hardness. But so you're like, oh, okay, cool. But it's like, so wait a second, why is that? And I love, one of the things I love doing is sort of apologizing, by creating these like absurd situations where you're like, oh, well, you see, yes, they have learned to hack the matrix, and it turns out that everything in this world is actually completely fake. And so when the code of the bomb is not designed to interact with the code of the door, but this person has hacked the matrix, and now they have created bombs that interface with the code level differently. And you have to go in this completely different wild goose chase, and I love it so much. So again, I think that narrativism has its place, okay? Because the fact of the matter is, and we know that narrativism has its place. Okay. Full Metal Dragon says Derek was hurt by demolition charges. Ironically, I wasn't hurt by demolition charges. There's actually a great moment. If you go back to our Rise of the Rune Lords adventure path, okay, Bob's character Azius, okay, started off as an alchemist, and I told him this was going to be a horrible idea. You're going to hate it. And so then Bob, we kind of retconned that he was an alchemist, and we made him into a barbarian. But I didn't want to completely throw away his alchemist. So I wasn't going to do this originally, but I gave them free archetype. And then Bob picked up free archetype alchemist. So he was a barbarian with the free archetype alchemist, okay? And then it's a new system. I didn't know everything. The game came out in 2019. It was like 2020. So Bob eventually took this demolition charge feat. And Bob didn't take it for any game reason. He just took it because what else is he going to take? And it sounded like, oh, that's cool. I like blowing stuff up, very, very Bob level of thinking. And it never really came up until the third adventure. And you have to go take Fort Rannoch. Okay. And Fort Rannoch is this like fort that has been conquered by giants and ogres. Okay. And there's 2 gates. Okay. This is Fort Rannoch. Okay. And there's 2 gates, this gate and this gate. And the adventure describes how the ogres have piled up tons of debris and rock and barrels and piles of wood and corpses and God knows what in front of this gate. And then this gate is the one that is kind of open and defended. Now, of course, being an adventure path, they assume that this means then that the PCs will go, oh, well, we can't go that way, so I guess we have to go in this way, and we have to fight the, level appropriate encounter that is located here. And I even went so far as I set this up using terrain, and I basically didn't even set this area up. I thought there's no way that they're going to go to this. So naturally, being players, that is exactly where Bob went. And so Bob did this whole thing where he he snuck up to the castle gate, and he was so excited to use his demolition charge. And Bob didn't really understand how the rules worked. And it's like, for the first time ever, I looked at what it did, and I realized, like, this is going to be 4d6 damage. This is barely going to do anything, let alone clear this whole entire pile of rubble. And I just thought, man, that's so lame. Because in the fiction, I'm imagining his character sneaking up with this bulging backpack or sack full of, bombs, and, strategically placing them. And then I even said this, I think, we have a bunch of people renewing their membership for Adventurer. So thank you, Frosty. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Brian. Let's take a look here. That's 24 months for Brian, 24 months for Bob, and 17 months for Frosty. So that's 2 years for Bob and Brian. Thank you so much for that, gentlemen. So the players, I was imagining a Helm's Deep moment, right? When the Uruk-hai breached the deeping wall, right? And that, like the ogre, everyone's stunned as like massive chunks of masonry are raining down, across the battlefield. That is what I imagined, right? And yeah, that is particularly appropriate. And look, how did they get 24 months? Vin, Aaron, and I were the first three suspicious. I don't know, GM Scott. I don't know. I do not know. I don't recall Bob being one of the early ones either. YouTube is big YouTube is trying to scam you out of your month. But in the fiction, again, I'm not an explosives expert. I don't know how much, how many force newtons per square meter a exploding fake alchemical bomb generates. But in the fiction that we were all writing together while we were sitting there playing this game, Bob's dwarf, barbarian dwarf at that, loaded up. He used all of his alchemists, all of his infusions, all of his different potions, all of his different bombs, and he placed them all around the, the gate. And I go, yeah, you know what? I don't care what the mechanics say. In the fiction, fuck yeah, this works. The door, the debris goes exploding. 2 ogres that were on the inside, they get killed. Now, of course, even if I use all of Bob's bombs at once, they have like a splash radius of 5 feet. They're not killing shit. But when I think about what this would look like in a book or a movie or a TV show, what are you envisioning? You are envisioning Helm's Deep. You're envisioning this big explosion. You're envisioning, maybe not quite on that scale, but still a big explosion. And to me, the fiction trumped. And this was actually a big moment for me because it was kind of a realization that I was like, oh, you know what? I like Pathfinder 2 a lot, but boy, does this game have a lot of really heavy-handed mechanics first approaches to things. And it was kind of one of the first times that I was really kind of like, I don't know that I love this. I don't know that I don't know that I would allow this. We got a couple things here. So Cal says, so would asking how demo works be a fiction first approach to a mechanics first? I don't know that I understand this question, Kyle. So I cheated to make the game better. In the context of Pathfinder 2, yes. Yes, I did. And that is why, by and large, I prefer games where I don't have to cheat, where that concept of fiction first is the driving impetus of the game. And that way I don't have to cheat. So, yes, Full Metal Dragon. In the context of Pathfinder 2, if you let that demolition charge feat blow up the entire gate wall and kill 2 ogres and let him use 20 different alchemist bombs, you are cheating. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You are cheating. And I believe I was doing it not necessarily even to make the game better, because, I mean, game has a kind of a double-edged notion here. The game of Pathfinder 2 is actually worse by doing that, because I'm invalidating your choice of your feat. I'm making the feat do something it didn't do. What I am choosing to do is I'm not necessarily making the game better. I'm making the shared fiction more consistent, and I think making the fiction better. So that is where I would go for that. The mechanics would have the alchemists use all their bombs each day to create a 5-foot deep hole in the debris. After 2 weeks of daily blasting, the party gains access to the fort. Yes, rules as written, that is what they would do. Now, why is that? Well, it's very simple. Because what my party did, here, okay, right here, by going to the gate that they quote unquote weren't supposed to go to, okay, and going through and getting access, quote unquote, behind the scenes and not fighting the encounter that they were supposed to fight. The game doesn't want you to do that. It creates problems. It might lead to an unbalanced encounter, or it might lead to the game becoming maybe a cakewalk. It might invalidate, you might have had, imagine a different scenario, right? Where there was a bunch of ogres guarding that, and the dwarf snuck up, and maybe it didn't have all the debris, but it was just a locked, closed gate. But the dwarf sneaks up. Maybe he's a dwarf rogue alchemist, and he plants all these bombs along the base of the towers, and then sneaks away and blows them all up. And you describe in the fiction how there's a massive fireball, a resounding shock wave, masonry is exploding, pulverizing, being turned to dust. A massive cloud of smoke and debris sails across. The burnt, twisted remains of the gate hang askew as the the guard towers collapse. You hear the screams of ogres as they are crushed under falling tons of debris. And everyone's like, well, that was pretty cool. But from a certain perspective of Pathfinder 2, you might, the fighter might go, man, I chose to be a fighter so that I could engage in combat. I took these feats so that I could, dual wield these flick maces, and I wanted to go fight those ogres. And now, because the rogue alchemist made a couple checks and blew up the towers, now I don't get to have my cool fight. This is what I was talking about when I was talking about like this idea of like people wanting protection from the game or from their fellow players or from each other. Again, this is one of those things that like it never bothered my group, but that doesn't mean it didn't bother other group. When we used to play 3rd edition D&D and earlier, if we got into a fight with something and the wizard or the cleric, because the clerics had instant death spells too. If the wizard or the cleric got roll high on initiative, snapped off a disintegrate or a death spell or a destruction spell or an implosion spell or a phantasmal killer spell, take your poison, or cloud kill spell, and just killed the, whatever thing that we were fighting. And I was like a fighter or a paladin or, something like that along those lines. I was never mad about it. I was like, cool, we won. And that was easy. And I didn't have to risk my character. So I was like very fine with that. But I understand that is a very unique way of approaching the game. And that not a lot of people necessarily see the game that way. And that's how I see it. So that's one of the reasons why I sort of, kind of go to this. Let me hop back here. And Pumpkin says, I couldn't in good conscience allow the fiction to trump the mechanics here. So Pumpkin, you're saying that you wouldn't have allowed the explosion to rip off the gate. Is that what you're saying? Yes, Anon, this is what we call the ludonarrative dissonance. And games, RPG games that have these mechanics can create these sort of, again, ludo is meaning game, what is happening in the game versus what is happening in reality. And again, another classic example of this where this doesn't matter and no one cares and it never comes up. If anything, it's just funny, is a game like Magic the Gathering, which on the surface has a lot in common with a role-playing game. And yet, in Magic the Gathering, I can equip a Sword of Fire and Ice. Hell, I could equip a Sword of Fire and Ice and a Sword of Feast and Famine, and I could equip them to the Mystic Snake. Just a snake. And now this snake is dual-wielding swords, and they have the same effect as if it was a person or an ogre or a giant or an elf or what have you. You could even have a car that was a vehicle, and then you could crew the vehicle. It turns into a creature. You could equip it with a sword, and it could go fight with a sword. Because the game doesn't care about this fictional element of the game. There's like a surface level. But I argue that some games, 4th edition D&D, Pathfinder 2nd edition to a certain extent, Pathfinder 2 for sure, 4th edition D&D for sure, maybe like D&D 5th edition to a certain extent, are actually more like Magic the Gathering than you think. In that, while it's not necessarily the case that you could equip, 2 swords to a snake, I think we can all understand that if I'm playing a character ancestry who has multiple arms, the game is still only going to let me use 2, right? Because if I could just, you have 4 arms, why can't you wield 4 swords? Well, because that would break the game. So, it's kind of like the opposite way of looking at the ludonarrative dissonance, but there's a lot of modern games where it would basically go, look, it doesn't matter how many arms you have. You can only equip 2 hands worth of things. What about my prehensile tail? Did you take the feat? No. Then no. And by the way, when you do get that prehensile tail feat, the only thing that you can do with that tail is a certain very limited set of options. You can't wield a 3rd sword in your tail, because that wouldn't be fair to the characters who don't have a prehensile tail. So I don't know what Pumpkin says, but hide his eyes. I agree with you. I couldn't in good faith do it the other way. Obviously the ogres don't notice, of course. And of course they did, and at that point I go, look, if you guys are going to play fast and loose, boy, I'm going to play fast and loose. And this is where I come in and I go, okay, well, all the ogres are attacking you, let's go for this. Okay, so what Kyle was saying is, instead of treating strictly as mechanics first and ignoring the fiction, approaching with fiction in mind while still acknowledging the mechanics. Well, Kyle, I think you're right. I think that's probably the best way to do it. But at the end of the day, you do have to make a decision about what is the rule here. Is it what's the fiction, or what is going to happen here? What trumps the other one? Is it the fiction or is it the mechanics? Because if somebody has something on their character sheet and they go, I want to use this, and you say no, that can be very off-putting in a mechanics first game, because it's kind of supposed to happen in a certain sense. Is this why you have given up on PF2? It's not even why I've given up on PF2, Full Metal Dragon. It's why, in general, for the last several years, I have been less and less interested in what I would call trad D20 style games. Because what interests me more than playing a fair and balanced competitive sport game is creating ad hoc, cool, funny, cringy stories with my buddies. And so that's why I've kind of given up on PF2. And I completely agree with Hyde's eyes here. PF2 is a very good game. It is a very good game. The same way that I think Magic the Gathering is a very good game. Would I use Magic the Gathering for my role-playing games? Maybe not. It's not my kind of game, and Derek's story illustrates exactly why. So I want to be very clear about that. I do think that the Pathfinder 2 game, as a game system, as a mechanics-first game system, is very well designed. And one of the best, honestly. One of the best. Now, Elia is kind of bringing up this sort of new breed. A lot of times, what Elia is describing here is usually classified as OSR, or sometimes actually now like new SR, where it is a mechanics first game, but they're not obsessed with game balance. Okay. And the game basically says, this is technically a mechanics first game in that we have rules and there are things that you're supposed to do, but also we don't really care about those rules. and the players shouldn't really care about those rules, and the game isn't really trying to be fair or balanced. And that gives the GM a lot of leeway to kind of do this sort of hybrid amalgamation of fiction and mechanics, right? KC says same mechanic first games that use those mechanics to reinforce the fiction. Josh, what'd you miss? Oh, I don't know about Josh. We missed a bunch. We've been talking and sharing stories, talking about game. And again, yeah, I think it's a great game. I think it's brilliantly designed. And there are times where it is exactly what I want from an RPG. Just not recently. I mean, we played the game basically through 2019, 2020, all through the pandemic, 2020. Then we started this channel. So then we had our home Pathfinder 2 game, and then we had our televised Pathfinder 2 game. Then we did a second Pathfinder 2 AP. I was a player from 1 to 20 in another Pathfinder 2 campaign run by Smith. And then we played Abomination Vaults, kind of in person with one person. Actually they started off remote and then we finished without them just because we wanted to play at the table without any tech. That's just a lot of Pathfinder 2 in, 4 years time. So, kind of get burned down on it a little bit. I'm sorry, but no, it may not be as cool, but I wouldn't allow it. And, we're getting to an important component here, which is the problem, okay, with fiction first, okay? And if you know this channel, then you know what I'm going to say here, okay? So fiction first has one major problem. Okay. It doesn't have to, but it can heavily rely on GM's biases and preferences. And now this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but I mean, it is something that we need to kind of talk about and we need to think about, which is if you're playing a game where the mechanics can be co-opted or they can be put to the back seat or they can be ignored or they can be expanded upon as fits the communal fiction of the game. But in theory, the game is mechanics first, okay? So this is the important thing. We're playing a mechanics first game, but we're treating it with a fiction first approach. Well, oftentimes, whatever the GM thinks is cool or whatever they like, whatever they're biased towards, they're going to allow. And whatever they don't like or they don't think is cool or doesn't make sense to them, they are going to disallow. And this can create a lot of feel bad feelings. And it can change the game. It can change the game to one where instead of trying to figure out a way how to beat the scenario, you're kind of trying to figure out a way to beat the GM. And you're trying to say or do the thing that is going to make them agree with you, right? And so,
tip $3.
When you play a mechanics first game,
simulationist game like GURPS, the mechanics don't care about the game or the narrative at all. They simulate reality, the fiction, dispassionately.
So what about a deeply simulationist game like GURPS? The mechanics don't care about the game or narrative at all. They simulate reality dispassionately. Ikemos. So yes, this is a game, GURPS, and like any simulationist game, right? It's not trying to be a good game. Definitely not. And it definitely doesn't care about the narrative. It only cares about simulating the fiction. So, it's been a while since I've played GURPS, but I would say that by and large, GURPS is a mechanics first game. But their goal was to create so many fucking mechanics, and they're not concerned about modeling balance. They're concerned about modeling reality. But by creating so many mechanics and having them be accurate to what would physically happen, you create a very smooth transition to fiction because you don't have to worry about whether or not there's a rule for this, because there probably is a rule for this. And then when you look it up, it's not like, oh, you can only put 3 grenades on a door at a time. No, like The game is going to give you a comprehensive rule set to figure out exactly how many things, how much damage that does, you know? And so I think that's an important thing to note. So Damien, with his member chat, said, Star Wars has a fix for this. You get an extra maneuver action without a cost. Damien, fix for what? Maybe it's something that we were talking about at the time, but I assume you mean Star Wars Fantasy Flight game Star Wars? Lee says, I think because there is no need to avoid combat anymore, it can be disappointing when the combat expert doesn't get to fight, but it's just as disappointing for the rogue. Well, by and large, Lee, I think at this point, they've basically made it so that all classes are combat classes. And that's not actually bad design, because the fact of the matter is, I kind of, you know, the old school games, I know this sounds crazy, but in old school D&D games, you know, first edition, nobody was a good fighter except for the fighter. You know, clerics were a spellcaster, and their big claim to fame was they weren't actually completely horrible in combat. But rogues, thieves, wizards, everybody else, horrible in combat. The only people that were good at combat were called fucking fighters. And, you know, rangers and paladins, but, you know, who could qualify for those? So again, the cleric's big claim to fame was that they weren't absolutely dog shit at combat. But the idea was that only the fighter was good at fighting. The thief was good at, you know, thieving and doing rogue shit and sneaking around and doing all that stuff. Wizards were good at wizarding. And they were good at casting spells, which could potentially be useful in combat, but they weren't like designed or balanced around combat. For God's sake, they couldn't wear any armor. Their AC was 10, and they had D4 hit points, which you rolled. So they could easily have 1 or 2 hit points. I mean, completely nonsense. And before anybody says anything even crazier, thieves, aka rogues, also had D4 hit points. So horrible. Monks had D4 hit points. They started with 2D4, but they got only 1D4 per level. So it was a very different game. And so the idea was that not everybody has to do everything all the time. Now, of course, combat was much quicker back then, so it wasn't so bad. I mean, I remember growing up and, you know, everybody's the same level and playing, you know, first edition D&D or whatever. And there'd be a fight, and you would have 2 or 3 people who, you know, because you had larger parties back then typically. And you might have retainers, you might have some henchmen, but there might be 2 or 3 people who basically go, I don't get involved. I'm not, you know, have you ever seen that, you know, in a scene from a movie where, like, think like Game of Thrones, right? There's that scene when they're in the arena and Marine and they're being attacked by the Sons of the Harpy. And, you know, Jorah Mormont is there, and, Grey Worm is there, and they're fighting off the assassins, and Dario Naharis is there, and they're fighting off the assassins. And, like, Missandei, the translator, and Daenerys, the queen, are basically just huddled in the middle. And so, along with Tyrion, because none of them are combatants, they're just sitting this one out. So by and large, that idea is very anathema to modern game design. And so we just don't do it anymore. Lance says, where's my 4-weapon training feat? Exactly. And then you say the 3 green is actually pretty sweet. Let's see. So, if this doesn't describe a Knights of the Last Call member, I don't know. I actually hate simulation. Well, I like simulation sometimes. Oh, that's kind of interesting. Let's see here. Catching up here. I think the funny thing about OSR is that it's set up in a way that anything well-designed or poorly designed can be portrayed as a feature instead of a bug. I mean, there's some truth to that. Let's see. Is it fiction first or mechanics first to use a mechanic, 20 strength, and feat to back it up? If you stay in the fiction and say you kick the door down because the fiction is that their PC is strong. That, okay, so are you saying there's no die roll? Because if that's the case, technically there was a mechanic. It was just what we call a karmic resolution. And in a karmic resolution system, you are usually comparing some sort of number to another number. It's not random, but you're saying you are this strong, you can kick the door down. So technically, that is still a mechanics first approach. It's just, because if you're tying it specifically to a feat and a specific strength number, then I would still say it is mechanic. The difference is we're used to thinking of mechanics. We think dice rolls. We think fortune-based game mechanics. But there are other game mechanics, including karmic ones, and dramatic ones, which are what we would typically call a narrativist mechanic to a certain extent. But karmic-based resolutions aren't really very popular anymore. Turns out people like rolling dice and they like randomness. So yes, GM bias is very huge in fiction first, and this could be absolutely the biggest problem with them. And not only is it a problem, but it also is because the GM's biases might alter the nature of the game, but also because some GMs don't want to have to make all those decisions. They don't want to have to figure everything out, and so that can be a really big problem. Let's see. By the way, I think outside of combat, 5e is profoundly fiction first in its design. Maybe not in its implementation, but I actually agree with Hide His Eyes here, and I think this is why 5e has so many problems. Because when you read 5e, at least when I've read it, and I haven't played it for many, many, many years, as many of you have, 5e seems to basically be like, here are the rules, but fuck them, they're not even that good. I mean, that really seems to be the writing style of 5e. Here's some rules, but I wouldn't don't pay too much attention to them. We feel like we should give you some rules, but we don't really care about them. And I agree. I think that's true kind of even into combat, honestly. And so I think that chafes against a lot of modern game people they really do want more of a Pathfinder 2 or 4th edition D&D game experience. And 5e comes up with this just really like, I just think it's so funny. Like people have been just shitting on advantage and disadvantage as being profoundly uninteresting and unfun forever. And I always thought it was a very clever mechanic and very easy. And then Dragonbane comes out, and Dragonbane uses boons and banes, and they're exactly the same thing as advantage or disadvantage. You're rolling 2d20 and taking the high, or you're rolling 2d20 and taking the low. Sure, they stack. But honestly, once you're rolling 3d20 keep high or 4d20 keep high, the outcome doesn't change that much. You can only get so high, or you can only get so low. And people are like, I love it. And so it always struck me as like, I don't think there's actually any problem with advantage or disadvantage. I think that people wanted something that was more mechanics first rather than fiction first. So I think that's important. Let's see here. Hide His Eyes. I'm not going to tell you no. Patreon.com/Knights of Last Call. You can sign up as a knight, a champion, a hero. Our Exalted and Legend tiers, which are very expensive, are sold out. Actually, there might be one opening, but we'll see. Let's see. Oh, okay. Star Wars fixed extra limbs that way. Got it. Okay, thank you, Damien. Okay, Hide His Eyes. Okay, I half agree with Eric here. I think 5e is great once you figure out how to use it, which is hard because it's badly written. Yeah, I don't think it's particularly well written. I mean, it is kind of just like, YOLO. I mean, 5e was written by a skeleton crew. You know what I mean? Well, no, here's the thing. 5e, in theory, was made... 5e was made for the people that we aren't. 5e was made for the people who stopped playing D&D and during 4th edition, okay? It was made for people who had switched to Pathfinder 1, but maybe they were finding Pathfinder 1 just to be too mechanical, too clumsy, 5e D&D was trying to not even necessarily get back to people from 3rd edition. I think 5e D&D was trying to get people who stopped playing the game after 2nd edition, right? I think 5e D&D was trying to get the people who grew up playing, basic. I mean, this is why Aaron and I like 5e D&D. It's why when I played Keep on the Borderlands B2, I used 5th edition, because to me, 5th edition D&D, ignore feats, and you could even ignore skills, I suppose, if you wanted to, and just say, oh, if it's a strength thing, you add your proficiency. If it's not, you don't. But like 5e is the most similar game to what I would say it BX D&D since, BX D&D. So like after basic D&D, which came out, and then you had 2nd edition D&D. 2nd edition D&D was not like basic D&D. Then you had 3rd edition D&Ds, all the skill points and the feats and the prestige classes and all that other stuff. 4th edition D&D, obviously all the powers and, the roles and the response. And then 5th edition D&D to me is an old school game. I view 5th edition D&D as an old school game. It has a little bit of modern polishes to it. But by and large, it's written kind of haphazardly and the balance is questionable. It's all over the place. Maybe nothing works. I don't know. That sounds like an old school game to me. And the reason I like 5th edition D&D is because to me, it plays like a modern OSR. 5e launched the OSR. That's not exactly true, Beowulf. OSR got launched during the 3rd edition era, and I think 4th edition D&D in particular really helped launch the OSR. Here's 1,000 pages of rules written in muddy natural language, but you don't really need to follow the rules if you don't want to. It's interesting. I wasn't able to go onto Roll for Combat stream this week, but I did jump in for a few minutes, and I left a super chat because Steven pulled out his old 1st edition DMG, and he was describing with him and his friends, in high school or whatever, junior high, looking at it and sitting around, and I knew exactly what he was talking about, and I was like, reading the old DMG, I said, was more like Bible study than it was reading a rule book. Right? In theory, you would look at the old DMG as a rule book, and we should all read it, and we should all get the same thing out of it. Right? That's, in fact, I would argue is what most modern game designers are trying to do, is to have one set of rules that everybody interprets the same. But the 1st edition DMG was not like that. In fact, like I said, it was like the Bible, where you could just turn to a chapter, combat, chapter 2, verse 5, and just read this passage. Maybe you've read it before. Maybe you've never read this part before. Maybe you skipped over it. Or maybe you're reading it now, but you're reading it with a group of people, and you're trying to figure out, what was Gary trying to say? What was he trying to tell us? How would this change the way that we are going to run our game? And like I said, it was much more of a philosophical approach to running a game. So I think 5e was really trying to do that and get back to that. And unfortunately, it became very popular. And I don't think it became popular because it's a great game engine. I think it became popular for a variety of other reasons. Stranger Things, Critical Role, whatever. And so you had all these people picking up D&D, and here comes D&D 5e, which is sort of written with D&D kind of got, shit on and YOLO and, figure it out. Here's some stuff. Here's some ideas. Maybe it works. Maybe it doesn't. And, have fun with it. Now, when Ian is saying here, I like when a system reads like programming documentation. That is 4th edition D&D. And people fucking hated it because they said it felt soulless and it felt, completely, devoid of passion, and there was no natural language, right? Everything was done in like bullet points and traits and tables. And so, while I agree with you, though, that if a game system reads like a programming documentation, well, then that's very useful if what you want to do is play the game by the right set of rules. But D&D 5th edition, I think, is I don't think it's poorly written. I think it's written the way it is on purpose. I think they were trying to channel that kind of Gygaxianism, which, made it, very cool for people like me, but I think it was very frustrating for all these new people who are getting into the hobby, and you're getting in with a game engine that isn't necessarily designed to really tell you exactly what you're supposed to do, right? It was all kind of a bunch of suggestions and maybes and shrugs. And that can be very frustrating for a lot of people. The old love-hate relationship with 5e. For all its flaws, it got me into the hobby. Well, John, I mean, like, look, you're here now. You know, keep playing 5e if you love it. Find other games if you don't. There's plenty out there. I do not know. I don't think I've read this. Chronicle of Playing OD&D is a great way to see someone trying to make that game work despite its opaque design. I mean, OD&D is very, very clearly about one thing. I mean, to a certain extent, it kind of was. I mean, you have to remember that when 5th edition D&D was being made, I mean, D&D was on life support. You know, 4th edition had sputtered out. The audience was fractured. People were really not talking about D&D. It was very unpopular. You know, Paizo and Pathfinder were kind of grabbing tons of market share. You know, I think a lot of people reasonably thought that there would never be, that D&D could die. And that, you know, the handful of people that were putting together the game were just sort of like, let's put something out there as a final for, you know, a final hurrah, one last edition. And let's try to maybe, you know, do some mea culpa and go back to some of the earlier concepts that the game was sort of founded on. And, you know, just make the game fun and don't worry about it, you know? And unfortunately, like, the game became super popular. Well, I mean, this is true. Again, smart designers are learning how to, right? That was the problem with 4th edition. You could say you didn't like 4th edition. That's fine. Hopefully it's for a good reason. You know, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong if you have your good reasons. But the biggest mistake was that nobody learned from it. You know, they just threw the baby out with the bathwater. I think smart, clever, well-meaning, independent designers are looking at the editions, and they're looking at games like Pathfinder 2 and 4th edition D&D and 5th edition, saying, how can we take the best of all worlds here and, you know, create something that is easy to read, but fun to read? And how do we create something that has a lot of clarity, but also has a lot of flavor, you know? And I think that some of these games have figured that out, and they're doing very well on it. I think Shadow Dark is probably one of those games, and that's, I think, the reason why they're being rewarded with so much market share. Oh, absolutely. I mean, we played again. We played our 5e hack that we called 5 Torches Deep, you know, 5 Torches Deep plus Dungeon World plus Torchbearer plus 5e D&D, and we called it Dungeon Time Extreme. And, you know, we were just kicking ass and taking names. I will say that Dragon Bay might be better, though. It's great for beer and pretzels. If I was planning on running, I thought I just had it up. If I was planning on running B2, Keep on the Borderlands again, and I wanted to run it kind of an old school, fun, you know, beer and pretzel style, I used a very hacked, chunked up version of 5e to do it. I would probably run it with Dragonbane today. I think it would be ideally perfect for that. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, our 5e experience was awesome and it was amazing. You know, we had a lot of fun. I mean, again, remember, you have to realize how stupid this thing was. Like, we had like 7 players, but very rarely was, you know, there were probably 5 people, but, you know, it was a changing cast. But we had 4 dwarves in the party. And the first time that all 4 dwarf players were in the same party, I was like, I don't think anyone's ever seen this before. 4 dwarves in the same party. This has never happened before in D&D history. This may have never even happened in the world's history. And we're like, oh, well, didn't you know that when 4 dwarves are together, they can join together their magical rings and summon an earth elemental? And everyone's like, what? I'm like, oh yeah, totally. And the dwarves are like, sweet. And we summon an earth elemental. I was like, oh, well, I didn't say it was friendly. And then the earth elemental attacked them. And they destroyed it. And I was like, oh, it collapses and it leaves behind like a 500 GP diamond. And they're like, sweet. And then they take it. And they're like, oh, man, this is awesome. We're totally going to summon elementals. But of course, throughout the entire rest of the campaign, I think there was only one other time that all 4 dwarves were present. Now, can dwarves randomly summon, elementals when 4 of them get together and put their magic dwarf rings together? No, that's not in the rules, believe it or not. But that was the ultimate, beer and pretzels kind of just like YOLO, ha, 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 funny. I'm not really caring about the game's balance. I'm not really thinking about whether this is a good story beat. I'm just trying to entertain people here at this point. And it just seemed funny. So that's why we went with it. Yeah, 4E is unfortunately very much handicapped by the GSL. Who was it that crapped on MCDM for doing that with Flea Mortals? I don't know. Flea Mortals, I think, well, not KLC, I don't think, because we love that book. I think Flea Mortals is an awesome book. Let's see here. Alias says, this is why I like mechanical frameworks. A game that gives me solid and useful tools, not an endless carved in stone list of thousands or a list of thou shalts and thou shalt nots. Well, and I've said it before, but one of the reasons why I really like Forge in the Dark games, Blades in the Dark and stuff, is because that game has it's very much fiction first. But what it does is it gives you a very easy translation engine that lets you convert the fiction that is happening, okay, in our game into discrete mechanical outcomes that we can all understand. And so I think that Forged in the Dark does a really good job. Again, fiction first, right? Fiction first is really good at making sure that we are all sort of in the same headspace, right? Or in the same mind space, right? We're all imagining the same things, okay? But mechanics are still important because this is a game, and we want there to be player agency, and we want for people to understand in an easy to grasp way what the impact of their action is going to have on the game. And we can do that, like in Blades in the Dark, with position and effect. And again, we've talked about this before here, but position, P, is, are you in a controlled position? And we're going to do a poll here. Are you in a risky position? Are you in a desperate position? Now, remember that the interesting thing about Blades in the Dark is you might think that this is difficulty, right? That this is DC difficulty. It's not, because all things in Blades in the Dark are just as hard as anything else. Your chance of success doesn't change based off of how hard something is. This is how bad are the consequences should something go wrong, right? If you're in a controlled position, the consequences aren't that bad. If you're in a desperate position, the consequences can be pretty bad. And then for effect, technically, we have none, limited, standard, great, and extreme. Well, what the hell does that mean? Well, honestly, it kind of means whatever the table thinks it means. If somebody chooses to use a spoon to knock down a door, you might say, well, that is going to have no effect. If someone chooses to use a hammer that they found, one GM or one table might say, well, that's limited. Another group might say that's standard. Another group could pull out a crowbar, and you might say, oh, that's great. Right? So this is that GM bias thing. But the important thing here is that in Blades in the Dark, it's not just the GM. It's a conversation. It's all the players kind of mutually agreeing what is the tone of our game like. So I said there's going to be a poll, and it's going to be a poll in two parts. The first is, so with the example, okay, with the example of Asius blowing up the gate with his bombs, what position would you use? So remember, we are trying to be fiction first here, and we're saying, yes, you could totally do this, but I don't know what the outcome will be. You don't know what the outcome will be. And plus, it'd be fun to kind of disclaim decision-making, and let the dice enter. But we do need to decide what is the position of Asius in this situation. Now, there's a lot of ways that you could approach this, because on one hand, I mean, I could argue that, are these actual bombs or PF2 bombs? Great question. This is fiction first gaming. We are playing, Bob is an alchemist with a satchel full of volatile chemical explosives, okay? And he's also a dwarf barbarian who's actually just a failed barkeep who, has turned to mixing up poisons and bombs in his spare time. So, take that for what it's worth. So while this poll is going on, we did just get another $20 super chat from Save Versus. John Wick has a new RPG, okay? John Wick has made some nice RPGs. He makes a point to say the die roll only determines who narrates the action, not just success and failure. I need to keep reading, but I don't know my incentive to pick a lock and not say I picked it. He makes a point to say the die roll only determines who narrates the action, not success or fail. I got you. So in other words, if you make the die roll, it's like, okay, you get to say what happens. And you don't know what your incentive is to pick a lock and not say I picked it. The answer is, say versus, if the player has the same agenda as the GM, wherein they want to see a good story. We've talked on this channel before, right, about director stance and author stance and actor stance. If you are, as a player, are in a director stance where you're thinking more about what would make for the better story overall, that would be the incentive. But like you said, you might need to read more, but that would be your incentive. And the answer is, there's two options. One, if the game uses some sort of narrative metacurrency, it might be that if you allow yourself to fail now, you might get points or bonuses that you can use to guarantee your success later. Some games use that as a mechanical incentive to encourage that kind of behavior. If it has none of that, then it's strictly relying on the fact that the player's agenda is not of the typical stance that we're used to thinking of, which is the author stance, or the actor stance, where you're like, I am my character. I'm going to make the decisions that are best for me because that is what I would do if I was in those shoes. And so that's how I would answer that. But thank you so much for that. Let's see. All right. We have, okay. So it's interesting. This is interesting. Okay. So the poll is over. 79% of people said risky, and 12% said controlled, and only 8% said desperate. Now, to be clear, this isn't too surprising because, typically risky behavior is the default behavior, right? You're neither desperate nor controlled. But let's break this down a little bit, because you know what? I think anybody could be correct here, and I think that it would really determine the tone of the game that you were setting for. All right. Is it risky? Sure. Now, this is, by the way, why I love Blades in the Dark. We'll get to it in a second. So Dan is saying, did they have time to set up the bombs without any pressure? And Dan, I think you're exactly right. To me, because this was a guarded fortress, there were ogres. Now, they may not be like actively standing outside of the gate, but there's ogres around, there's patrols, there's people. He doesn't have all the time in the world. He's not a super trained rogue. He's not super stealthy. So it being controlled doesn't seem particularly appropriate. Also, we're talking about somebody dealing with a bunch of high explosives, right? And then trying to blow up a thing. And they're not like, this isn't modern day C4, right? This is a pretty crazy situation. On the other hand, right, they don't know he's there yet. He did sneak up to the gate, right? He's not desperately fumbling for a bomb to set it off before they get to him, right? He's not under the pressure. He's not under the gun. So I don't think desperate would be right either. So I actually do really agree with the group saying that this is risky. But now, as a GM, okay, that is pretty funny. We just had a new super chat from our good friend Damien, who says every Derek stream turns into a Blaze in the Dark stream. Well, listen, it's one of the best games of all time. That's a great question. Did the guards have an opportunity to spot him crossing the field with his explosive? Was a sneak check made? Full Metal Dragon, if we felt like that was appropriate, we absolutely could have required that he make some sort of stealth check to even get appropriate, up to where he was at. All right. Now, we've established that his position is risky. Now, the next question, okay, given our example, right, of Azius using his alchemical bombs, and in theory, to blow open the door and clear the debris so we can get in. That's what his stated objective is, right? What would you say the effect of this action should be? And again, remember, it's none. We'll get rid of none because I don't think anyone's going to say that it should be none. Limited, standard, great, and extreme. Now, of course, you're like, what do these really mean? Well, the answer is they mean whatever your group has sort of determined them to be. Now, typically, standard is going to be you accomplish what you were trying to set out to do, right? You get what your effect would be. Limited means you're successful, but it's not as successful as you would want it to be, right? You didn't fail, but you didn't get everything that you wanted to. If you were trying to earn $1 million, well, you didn't earn $1 million. Sorry, but you did earn 250,000, which you should be very impressed with. And then obviously great and extreme are levels of beyond that. Let's say we got another super chat from Damien. Says, how Bob screwed this up. How Bob screwed this up made me join the Patreon. Well, that's an excellent. I mean, it's a great story, Damien. I mean, scenes like that, stories like this, the fact that we're telling the story and the story has been retold many times is why I play role-playing games. I do it because these crazy moments that just happen spontaneously, and I just love it when they happen. So the fact that that's what caused you to join the Patreon is fantastic. Let's see here. So again, people are, we've got the bombs, they're going off, and there we go. How effective is this going to be? High says, yes, this is why I love Blades in the Dark and Fiction First Play in general. Also, Blades in the Dark maybe run things this way in Dungeon World and even 5e. Position effect always there in the background. I completely agree. GM Scott says, if it's Pathfinder 2 bombs, limited. Maybe even none. If it's real bombs, then it's great. Okay. I say great, he has bombs. Now, what's interesting, Elia says, I'm going with great because it's just debris. It's not like it's a properly reinforced gate. This is correct. Now, here is what Elia is describing, by the way, is we are using the fiction to determine how effective this action should be. Because in the fiction, the GM, described how the gate had been breached and then stacked with a bunch of stone and debris and wood, right? Because they had broken the gate and they didn't want an open gate. So in her mind, that makes the PC's attempt to blow this up easier because rather than being a properly reinforced gate, it's just a big pile of debris. And that's really interesting because that is not driven by some sort of mechanical level-based appropriate, damage. It is just based off of what makes sense in the fiction. And to counterpoint with that, FMD, Full Metal Dragon, says, this does a good job explaining why I do not like Forged in the Dark systems. Did he mark bombs on his gear? What tier are the bombs? KC, now KC is getting into it. I didn't want to turn this into a Blades in the Dark stream. But, of course, remember, in Blades in the Dark, when you're trying to determine the effect, typically you are going to examine 3 things. You're going to examine potency, scale, and quality. Having an advantage in one or more of these, or having a deficiency in one or more of these, can shift the effect. If we assume, this is a very, 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 very simplistic heuristic or algorithm to apply. If we assume that all effects start at standard, one of the ways that you can determine the effect is by discussing, well, does your approach and does your action in the fiction, is it particularly potent against this, or is it particularly shitty against this? Right. The classic example is if you have a bludgeoning weapon, it has potency against skeletons, and that might be a reason why your effect might be greater than standard. It might be great. On the other hand, if you have a spear and you're fighting a skeleton, we might say that you have potency negatively, right? Which is to say you might have limited effect because the potency of your weapon, right, is limited because it's against a skeleton. Scale is how big something is or how many there are of something. Now, in some cases, scale could make things harder. Scale could make things easier. If you're trying to sneak 20 people in, that might be a factor to make it less effective. But if you're only trying to sneak 1 person in or 2 people in, maybe that's a more effective thing. So going back to our skeleton example, we might start with how effective is fighting a skeleton with a spear? And we might say, well, it's standard, but it's a spear. It lacks potency. We're going to put it at limited. And then we get to scale and we go, okay, well, this is a giant skeleton and you're just a normal sized dude. This thing is massive. I'm actually going to say it ticks it down another category, and baseline, unless you change something or do something or, change the fiction, your baseline attempt to fight this giant skeleton monster is going to have no effect. All right. GM Scott got a message retracted. I do not know. That was the auto mod, buddy. I do not know it did that, but if you said something, I did not see it. All right. Final results. Ending the poll. 53% of you said great, and 30% said standard, 7% said limited, and 7% said extreme. I honestly, okay, so I'm a little, well, I don't know if I'm biased here. I can totally see where, let's actually talk about these approaches, okay? We can talk about this from a fictional first standpoint too, which is, as a GM, if you give somebody risky, great effect for blowing up the things with the bombs, you are sending a clear message to them. I like this idea. I want to see more of it, right? This is the type of thing that I want to emphasize, right? This is the type of thing that I want to see. And I think your idea is really good. So I am rewarding you are interacting with the fiction well. And as a result, me and the game are rewarding you with increased success. And I'm just like I just think that is such a great way to run the game. That being said, if you did say standard, I don't necessarily think that you are wrong. And in fact, I probably would have gone with risky standard. And the reason why is because, standard means you do it, right? It just doesn't have any extra effect. And given that it's, a bunch of small alchemical bombs in a big pile of debris, you're not particularly trained at this. I think giving someone standard is probably pretty generous. Now, Dan says limited because they don't have the feat. So I think going with great is totally fine. I probably would have gone with risky standard, honestly. Yeah, that's a kind of an interesting takeaway. I was kind of curious how that. And again, you know what? We went through all this rigmarole and we ended up with risky standard or maybe risky great. But you know what? That's fine because, you know, and you know what? This is the kind of conversation that I like to have and I would have. Again, we're discussing things in the fiction. So I go risky standard, right? And then Bob goes, well, what would great look like? If, you know, because Bob's allowed to ask that question, not in character, out of character. But I go, well, blah, 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 risky standard. And Bob goes, what would great success look like? And so now as a GM, I have to imagine what great success looks like. And I go, all right, standard success is the explosion goes up, the debris is cleared. It's still kind of difficult terrain. It's still kind of smoky and rumbly, but you can get through the gate. The gate is open and you can get in. That's standard success. Great success is this thing is like a mini nuclear bomb. It goes off. It turns into a big fragmentation grenade. The whole fortress is shook. You know what? Those couple of ogres that are nearby, they get killed by the explosion and the blast. That's what great success looks like. Now, I'm putting those two realities out there for Bob to decide. And we're just talking. We're talking about what we're talking about. It's literally a meta conversation. Bob might decide, oh, dude, I want that. That sounds sick. That sounds amazing. And he goes, okay, so how can I get to great effect? And I say, well, you can get to great effect if you have maybe something that you could use on your character sheet, actual explosives rather than just alchemist fires. But remember, you can always trade position for effect. You could shift from risky standard to desperate great by making your situation worse, but making the outcome better. And Bob's like, I kind of want to do that. And I'm like, okay, Bob, well, what would that look like? What would you taking this from risky to desperate? And Bob goes, the only way I can make sure that it goes off on time to get the ogres, I have to be super close. That way I can see when the ogres are next to the pile, or like maybe like I throw some rocks so that the ogres come and investigate. And then when they get really close and I see them, I push the trigger and the whole thing goes. And I go, dude, that's amazing. That's awesome. Yes, it's desperate because you're literally standing next to the explosion so that you can time it to blow up the ogres. So I'm going to let you do this from risky standard. Now we are at desperate great. And if you can get your 4, 5, 6 result, boom, you're going to blow, you're going to get those ogres. You're going to blow them up. It's going to be amazing. And he's like, okay, but what happens to me? I'm like, Bob, well, I think the fiction will tell us what happens to you. And this is a situation where if the player rolls a 6, boom, they got everything that they ever wanted, right? They blow up the debris pile. They kill a couple ogres. The whole compound is put off guard. And Bob is completely fine. There's no consequences for him whatsoever. That's the fun part of rolling dice, right? Is that we get to have these kind of amazing moments. Anyways, so that's what we just did there as a group is my favorite part of Blades in the Dark. It's my favorite part of Forged in the Dark games. It's not anything to do with the mechanics. It is the conversation about the conversation. It is the seamless interchange between the mechanics and the fiction. And we are constantly going back and forth between them. It is a yin-yang type relationship. And yes, every Derek stream turns into a Blades in the Dark stream because the elements of playing the game here are just so they should be applied to almost every RPG you play, but they are at their like most pure form, I think, in Blades in the Dark. So Beowulf saying, yeah, if they're small outcome of bombs, yeah, change from great to limited. Beowulf, I think that would be a totally reasonable thing. If you said, well, hey, how many alchemical bombs? And then now we're really getting into flashback. Now we're really getting to Blades in the Dark thing, because I might say, well, you probably didn't bring that many bombs, Bob. I'm going to say that you could put some in, but there's no way that you have enough explosives to clear this entire debris field. You could maybe make like a trench or like a dent in it that will allow you guys to get in, but no way you're clearing the whole thing. And that's where Bob goes, Derek, I want to do a flashback to the previous night where I'm sitting in my room tinkering with some extra potions, and I'm kind of cackling with glee as I'm loading up this extra sack full of nitronium charges. And I'm like, okay, I see it. And then, you spend the stress, and then we go back to the fiction. That is unique to Blades in the Dark. That is not necessarily something that I think everybody should like, flashbacks particularly. But I do think that this sort of seamless interlocking between fiction and mechanics is what, sort of in a very yin-yang relationship, because, that's the real key of it, is that, we talked about mechanics first and we talked about fiction first, but the truth of the matter is there should be an interplay between them, right? So you've got the GM, right, describing, right? And this is what we call literally the fiction. What does it look like? What are people doing? There's no game rules here. There's no mechanics here. We're just talking about that. All right. And then, the GM says, how do you want to do this? I don't say how, that's the Matt Mercer. I say, so what do you do? I'll describe a situation. What do you do? I describe a situation. What do you do? So I am just, we're the GM is describing the fiction, and the players, describe their actions. Okay. Now, this can actually go back and forth for quite some time. And in a broader sense, anybody in chat know what this loop here? If you're a Knights of the Last Call aficionado, or you play a lot of Blades in the Dark, or Powered by the Apocalypse, what is this process here called? Or what are we describing here? Anybody in chat? GM Scott says the game loop. Yes, but more generically than that. When I'm the GM and I'm describing something, and then the players describe what they're doing in the context. When I say their actions, I mean in the fiction. So this is what I call, there it is. Good job, GM Scott. This is what we call the conversation. And the truth of the matter is there's no rules. Okay. There's no, now KC says that this is FBT. Yes, to a certain extent, because it's going to flow into actions. And assuming that this conversation is about things that actually matter in your game, then it's not really FBT. Okay. So this is the conversation. I describe something, the players describe something. I describe something, the players describe something. Now, this is all fiction, right? This is all the fiction. But at some point, the player is going to describe their action in the fiction. And instead of the arrow, so this is where we start, and then we go to 2. And normally, after 2, there is a link back that goes back to 1. But sometimes it comes down to 3, right? Which is we have to apply the rules. And this is where PBTA games get a nice rap, is because PBTA games give you an agenda. And they basically tell you there are some things that we don't care about in the rules, and there are some things that we do care about in the rules. And this is why those games can be very difficult for people to use, because normally we think of the rules and rolling the dice as being used for everything. But in a fiction-first game, they're not. In a fiction-first game, you only roll when you need to, or when the game demands that you do. All right? So we apply the rules. We resolve the action. Now, at this point, by the way, we are out of the conversation, okay? We are now into the meta conversation, okay? This is, up here, this is where I'm like, all right, you can see the ruined fortress, ogres, their shadowy figures, large and looming, stride about the battlements and the ramparts of the once proud fortress. You can see two gates, one standing, proud and closed, the other shattered from the ogre's siege, now filled with a bunch of debris and other stuff. And then Bob goes, oh, okay, well, I want to, guys, I think I can blow that thing up. We can get in that way. It'll throw them off their guard. We're just conversating. We're going back and forth. That's the conversation. Now, at a certain point, Bob is going to be there. He's up against the wall. He's laying his bombs in. And the game shifts from the conversation, where we're talking in the fiction about the fiction, into a meta conversation about the rules and how to best apply them. And at this point, we start talking about what should the DC be and how many actions should it take, or should it be risky limited? Should it be desperate great? And this should still, in my personal opinion, continue to be a conversation. It's just a meta conversation. We are talking about our game as almost impartial adjudicators, right? So we figure out how to apply the rules. We resolve the action, okay? And then the action is going to, it's going to tell us or force us or restrict us in the type, or I should say in the way we continue the conversation. See, because before the rules got involved, when we were up here, okay, we could kind of say and do whatever we wanted to, right? But now the rules have gotten involved, and we had our meta conversation, and we all agreed, we basically agreed to what the bet was. If risky, limited. Well, what about desperate? Okay, we all agreed. Desperate, great. And we're very clear about what's at stake here, what you're going to be rolling. You're doing this with your eyes wide open. I'm doing this with my eyes open. And we're both agreeing. It's like agreeing to third-party arbitrage. We're agreeing at this point, because the rules have interceded, that you, the player, and me, the GM, are going to abide by the results of this die roll. So we now resolve the action. And the results of that action are going to enforce us in the way that we can continue the conversation, because this takes us back into the conversation. But rather than being able to say anything we want, now the rules have interceded, and they have sort of dictated a little bit. The dice roll has dictated what we're allowed to say and how we're allowed to say it. If Bob rolls that 6 and gets that great success with no complications, then I did have to describe that the doorway blows up and that everything we said was going to happen. The ogres get killed. And I can't be like, oh, but also the debris falls on you. No. That's not how the rules work. And we have to agree in the fiction. Now, you might say, well, but in the fiction, it might make sense that some debris would fall on him. I agree. But we are playing a game here. And the rules did get involved. And we have to abide by that. And if Bob rolled a 6, then he doesn't have any consequences. He doesn't have any fallout. If he didn't take devil's bargain or something like that, it doesn't matter. And we have to make the fiction make sense. So this is a situation where, even though we started with fiction first, the mechanics entered into the equation, and we need to respect that. We can't just ignore the mechanics now because it's convenient to do so. And I think that this gameplay loop of the conversation, the meta conversation, and then that meta conversation leading to a result of the rules, which forces a change in the way that the fiction is being resolved, I think is like one of the best parts of the game. So for me, I love how so much of this conversation is using demolition charge as the key example. Well, it's just a great example, and it's one that, you know, obviously is sticks out in sort of Knights of Last Call history, for sure. Yeah, well, so Blades in the Dark seems more emulationist than narrative, though. Yeah, I don't think Blades in the Dark is very narrative at all. Blades in the Dark doesn't really have... The only thing that Blades in the Dark has flashbacks. Flashbacks are pretty narrative. Flashbacks are pretty narrative, and I guess Resistance is fairly narrative. So I would actually say, yes, flashbacks and Resistance are narrative mechanics. It's the difference between arbitrating the shared fictional assumptions every role versus having those results be a clearer part of the rules. Yeah, I think I agree. For sure. Because, you know, when you can sort of point to it, like, we may not all necessarily agree, right, in Blades in the Dark, that, you know, if you look, like, if you fail a controlled roll, you might have a limited complication. And if you fail a risky roll, you might have a standard complication. And if you fail a desperate roll, you might have an extreme complication. And there may be some, you know, not necessarily complete clearness on what those are, but by and large, the players, the GM, the other players all understand that fundamentally what the difference is between an extreme complication and a normal complication. And there's examples in the book where, like, the GM goes, okay, and the guy takes you and arrests you in jail, and you go, whoa, I didn't know that the consequence was going to be that bad. And the GM's like, okay, that's my bad. We didn't clearly communicate. We need to make sure we're getting on the same page here. So Full Metal Dragon was talking about why they prefer PBTA. Yeah, PBTA avoids the meta conversation, more or less. I mean, it can still come up from time to time, to be fair, but PBTA avoids the meta conversation about how to apply the rules. PBTA is a little bit more direct. So I agree, actually, with Full Metal Dragon. I'm not saying that I agree that I like PBTA better. I'm just saying it is more direct, and it avoids having that meta conversation. So I do agree with them there. So Blades in the Dark isn't entirely fiction first. In the OSR, you convince your GM via your expert knowledge of explosives and skip the mechanics entirely. Here, Azius just sold the GM on what's cool. Well, that is true to a certain extent, because in Blades in the Dark and in Powered by the Apocalypse, Dungeon World, or whatever, the decision of, does this need to be a role, is still a valid conversation to have. And, you know, the classic example of this is in Blades in the Dark, in Powered by the Apocalypse. If my character comes up to a helpless character and hits them with their sword, that is not a move. Sure, but there's a hack and slash move. There's an action for fighting, for scrapping. No, those don't apply at this point, because the fiction is very clear about what would happen here. There's no disambiguity. We know what's going to happen. I should say there is no ambiguity. It has been well disambiguated. The outcome is very clear, and so actually the fiction should take the precedence here. And that is, again, that's the classic example which PBTA does, where it talks about now, that being said, we play games. This is my problem with OSR. I'm playing this game because I like the mechanics. I'm playing this game because I want to interact with dice rolls. I'm playing the game because I want it to be a little fiddly. That's why it's a game, and it's not just GM story time with the players. I don't hate having to roll. I don't hate dice rolls are exciting. Dice rolls are fun. And I like when we get to a place, even as a player, but I also really like it as a GM, where instead of it being up to me, we leave it up to fate. Playing to find out what happens is really exciting to me. I really, really like, removing my bias as often as I can. And that can lead to really fun places and unexpected places. This is a spoiler alert for root actual play. So spoiler alert for root. I'll do this when we're done. But in our root game, Bob's character, I had this idea of something he had said earlier, made me think of like his family or his brother. And Bob rolled like a 6- at some point. And so I used that opportunity to introduce his brother as like the leader of the rebel faction. And I was like really interested to see how this was going to play out. And in my mind and in my head, there was going to be this great pull, tug of war, tension between Bob and his emotions. And will he do what he's supposed to do? Or will he, and it wasn't even close. Bob, kicked that motherfucker off of the fucking, the tree city into an explosion. He died. And then there's no roll for it. I was like, yeah, he's just dead. And for me, that was very, very surprising. The spoiler is over. That was very surprising to me. I did not see that coming. And that is part of the reason why I play these games, is because I, the GM, want to be surprised too. I don't think I need to tell most of you out there, but like when you're playing a pretty, on the adventure path, when you're playing a pretty standardized game where the outcomes are pretty well locked in, or they're random, but they're so balanced against each other, you kind of already know what's going to happen before it happens. So the chance, in fact, I would say a lot of times in those situations, when things don't go the way they're supposed to go, you get annoyed because it means now it's more work for you. Maybe you're going to have to rewrite this adventure. Maybe you're going to have to throw the adventure out entirely. You just paid, $27 for it, whatever the situation is. So, we're all human. I mean, I'm biased to that as well. Another reason why I don't like adventure paths, not because I think adventure paths are dumb. They're not. They're really convenient and they're really easy. But then I get into situations where my players do something and I find myself getting frustrated that they did something different. God forbid. Because why? Because it makes more work for me and it makes it more, challenging for me. And I don't want that. That's the reason why I bought the damn adventure, right? Make it easier for me. So it's not necessarily that it's a bad thing. Yeah, I mean, it does. And the reason, I mean, a lot of games do, Dylan. It's not just Pathfinder. Trust me. There's a lot of games. But going back to the OSR, there's a lot of things in the OSR where they just, the players are like, I love it. It's just me and my GM talking, going back and forth in the fiction. And I go, yeah, but you've removed some of what Apocalypse World would call feralness. And there's a lot of, in my personal opinion, a lot more of a tendency to do what we call, or what I call, GM Mother May I. And you're really just, because the rules of the game are pretty explicit, and you are just trying to figure out a way to circumvent them and have your GM agree with you that they should be circumvented and that your action just succeeds. And I don't necessarily know that I think that is a great outcome. Now, what I do think is great, what I do think is awesome, is when we're playing an OSR game, and I do this all the time whenever I play basic D&D, and if somebody says something, I will basically say equivalently, I'm like, yeah, okay, how about this? Roll a D6. Now, that's a pretty good idea, but it's kind of risky. On a 1, 2, 3, or 4, it works. Or on a 3, 4, 5, or 6, it works. But on a 1 or a 2, it doesn't work, right? And the player's like, do I want to roll this die or not? And I go, choice is yours. I still find myself defaulting back to a dice roll often, just because I think they're exciting and I think that they're fun, Now, Akemos is saying something that I was exactly saying actually just today, I think, in the Discord, or maybe yesterday in the Discord. I mean, the problem with OSR feralness is that it's too punitive. Level 1 saves like 20% of the time. You play Mother May I with the GM because you want to avoid the mechanics, 100%. And I said a lot of times, in my personal opinion, the reason why people interact with the fiction and trying to get the fiction first is because they're actually trying to go, look, the mechanics are stacked against me here. Not many people are using, crazy ideas when they, their level 7 fighter is fighting a bunch of level 1 orcs. They go, I'm fine using the rules now because the rules really are to my advantage, right? My THAC0 is super low. My armor class is super high. These orcs are probably never going to even hit me. And so in that point, you're like, I'm cool with the mechanics. But when the situation is opposite and you're at a mechanical disadvantage, suddenly you're like, okay, how can I circumvent these rules? And I wonder how many of these OSR people who are very, very loving their OSR have their level 7 character with their magic armor and their shield and their high armor class. They've gained a couple levels. They've got their low THAC0. And then the GM describes how the lowly band of kobolds, they pre-laced the area with pitch and tar. The players completely didn't even bother to check. Because remember, there's no spot check. There's no perception check. So the players didn't specifically say that they were watching, that they on their way back to town, and the kobolds create a complete ambush zone. And the player and the GM goes, no need to roll. It's such an effective thing. I'm just going to say yes. And the yes is they all kill you brutally in a horrific ambush. They were so awesome. You guys would have loved to see it, and the player, that is exactly the type of thing that the players may have tried to do themselves. Convincing the GM, we're going to set up this kill zone. We're going to set up this kill box in this narrow ravine. We're going to fill these trenches with oil and cover them with dirt so they kind of look like them. We're going to shoot flaming arrows in and roll barrels down. We're going to take out that entire orc patrol. We're not even going to have to roll a single die. We're never going to be in trouble once. They're all going to be dead, and we're not going to have to roll anything because the fiction takes the control. That's all well and good, but what happens if that happens to you? How are you going to feel? I mean, you can be honest. You can be honest with yourself. If you can't be honest with me, you can be honest with yourself. You'd be pissed. You would be pissed off. You would feel like it was unfair. Let's see here. Yes, and I'm talking about a lot of extreme examples here, but High Desires is right. There is a sweet spot between Mother May I and Physics Engine. Agree. I also completely agree that PBTA and Fortune of the Dark hit that spot pretty well for me, and I completely agree with that situation. I completely agree with that. I just assigned advantage or disadvantage to the roll based on the fiction or the conversation. Beowulf, I think that is a fantastic way to handle that, and you know what? That is the reason why I like playing 5th edition, and it's also the reason why I think Dragonbane is such a great game, because that's exactly what Dragonbane does. It makes it simple, quick, easy, and everybody's on the same page. You don't even have to, in Dragonbane, you don't even have to set a DC. You just you describe something the way you describe it in the fiction, the way the player described it in the fiction, the way the GM described the fiction, and the GM says, "Yeah, sure, go ahead, make a might check, but do it with disadvantage because it's really heavy. Actually, do it with 2 disadvantages. It's really heavy, and you're drunk. Your character is basically tipsy as fuck, and they can't do anything. It's like, you could, and you're just responding to the fiction with a mechanical overlay." I'm not going to get into this, but never roll a diplomacy check if you can role play your way past things. This is actually the exact reason why I don't like that kind of behavior. That's like saying never make an attack roll if you can role play your way past the combat. Meaning role play be like, well, I kill him with my sword, Derek. And in the fiction, I have stabbed him with my sword. And I think you'll agree. I have studied fencing. I think you'll agree that my attack pattern of a fake thrust that led into a riposte, which then countered underneath the arm, where, as anyone will tell you, an armor like the Gambesson he is wearing is indeed not well protected. I think we can all agree that he would just be dead instantly. So I think we should just move on here. And for some odd reason, people don't like that. But when it's like, can I talk to the person and say things in character and then they believe me and the GM will just decide that it's true, everyone's fine with that. But the other way around, people always seem to have a problem with it. Let's see here. Role play, then roll with diplomacy with either advantage or disadvantage based on how you role played it. Well, so this isn't about the RP. See, this is the thing. I agree with what Beowulf is saying here, but it's not about the role playing. It's just about the fiction. What is true in the fiction, right? That is where I think that I want to make sure that, again, I'm very much of a stickler for the idea of like, it's all role playing, right? What you say isn't necessarily role playing. Everything is role playing. But in the fiction, your character is trying to convince this person. And in the fiction that we have established based off of factors, which could be what you've said, but it also could be based off of other things, you have gained a mechanical advantage. And since this is a game, and we're playing a game because we want to find out what happens, we're going to roll dice. Because if well, number one, this could not be important. If it's not important, then I would never roll anyways. You're right. I would just decide. You know why? Because the game doesn't care, and neither do I. In fact, I might have skipped this scene, so I don't even know why we're here. But if it's something that matters, will the elves put aside their quarrel with the dwarves and join together to fight off the orcish horde? That's a big moment in our game. And the fiction can dictate a lot of things. Well, you know what? You did kind of betray the elves a little bit, so I'm going to give you disadvantage. When the players can see how the fiction is influencing the mechanics, that's like the best. That's like the best moment for me in role-playing games. Absolutely. So for sure. I would leave the table because I'm a hypocrite. Well, you know what? At least you're fair. At least you're honest, I like the principles, but yes, you're completely right. I often engage with the fiction in the same way I engage with buildcraft to find an optimal solution. Don't beat yourself up about it. This is how a lot of us, most of us, almost all of us, I think, engage with the game. It's in our nature to try to, to win, Yeah. I mean, DC adds an additional layer of complexity to it because with the DC, you're trying to model objective difficulty of something, but it's not like the most flawed approach. I think it's fine. I'm just, what is the inherent difficulty of this task? Let's see here. Anime's mom says, somebody clip this. I don't know which part you were talking about clipping, but that's pretty good. Yes, but the role play, well, again, it's all role playing Beowulf. If you mean what my character said in character, that's just called your character was talking. It's not called role playing. It's all role playing. But yes, if you call the lady a man because you mistake her ugliness for manliness or whatever. Yes, I would agree with that. DB, we got a super chat coming in from Elia. Elia says, DB and Forbidden Lands are examples of games that have great frameworks that allow for anything PCs want to do and allows the fiction to make things easier or harder. And to be fair, like D&D 3rd edition, to a certain extent, D&D 5th edition, they kind of do this too. D&D has advantage and disadvantage. 3rd edition had the DM's best friend, which is in the DMG, where you can give a player +2 or -2 to their attack, to their roll, or you can give a +2 or -2 to the DC, depending on the effects. And so, that's kind of like the shifting range that you have. But those DCs were pretty much independent. It's when you get into games that do not have, when they have level-based DCs, that this becomes a real problem. And when the games have level-based DCs and stuff like that, when there's an expectation of the challenge rating and stuff like that, that is where you run into real big problems with this. The biggest advantage, in my opinion, that Dragonbane and Forbidden Lands have over, say, 3rd edition D&D or 5th edition D&D, is that there is no DC in Forbidden Lands. There is no DC in Dragonbane. You are basically those games, basically, there's only 3 possible outcomes. Either it's so impossible that there's no roll, it's so easy that there's no roll, or anything else in the middle, which is the outcome here is unclear. We're going to roll the dice. And there's no DC. In Forbidden Lands, you just need to roll a success. In Dragonbane, you just need to roll under your skill, equal or under your skill on a D20. It doesn't matter what it is. And you're like, okay, that's stupid. So my character has to roll in order to walk across the bridge? No, that in the fiction, we would say you can do this automatically. What about, I want to kick down the door. And the GM might go, yeah, it's just a normal door. Your character's a strong guy. You knock it down. It's totally fine. Now, if it's the ancient stone door to the great tomb of Nebuchadnezzar, yeah, okay. The GM says, well, look, you're a heroic badass. I'm not going to say it's impossible. Make your might roll with a disadvantage because it is a really big fucking door, right? That to me is a very compelling way to do this. And again, I grew up before 3rd edition D&D. I grew up playing 2nd edition D&D and basic D&D where we did not have DCs. There were no DCs. The only thing that you had was make a strength check, make an intelligence check, make a dexterity check. And guess what those were? That was the Dragonbane mechanic. It was roll your D20, no modifier, roll your D20, and if you get equal to or under your character's ability score, you succeed. And that was the only thing that we had in order to test the PC was rolling. And I like doing that. I've always liked doing that. For sure. Hey, we got another super chat from Save Versus. My friend's Pally diploed every encounter one game. It wasn't a Jedi mind trick, and it didn't work if the encounter was set on attacking us. And you know what? I think that's okay to a certain extent. Like if we look up the rules in Dungeon World for parlay, okay? Parlay Dungeon World. Let me go back to the PDF, or let me go back to the whiteboard. So parlay is a move in Dungeon World that is basically the charisma action, okay? And it covers intimidation and it covers, whatever. And the key thing with this rule in Dungeon World is this very first line here, which is when you have leverage on a GM character and manipulate them, roll plus charisma. Leverage is something they need or want. So this already puts this, additional level of qualification into the game, because diplomacy is not mind control. The idea is this move does not trigger in the game of Dungeon World unless you have leverage on a character, and leverage is something that they need or want, and you are trying to manipulate them. Anything else is not handled by the parlay move. It would not trigger the parlay move. If a player went up to the horse merchant and said, give us 4 horses, and they're sitting there expecting the GM, and they've got, a really high charisma, right? They're expecting, they're coming from D&D. They're expecting the GM to say, all right, roll parlay, and then the player's going to get what they want. No, the GM would say, the horse keeper looks at you up and down and says, who the fuck are you? Get the hell out of here. And the player's like, what? What? No, why aren't I parlaying? And the GM says, because this move doesn't care. This move doesn't trigger. You don't have any leverage on this character. There's nothing that they need from you. There's nothing that they want from you. So you cannot parlay with them. You have no leverage. So this is like one of the reasons why I really like parlay in Dungeon World, and I really dislike the way that diplomacy is written, because diplomacy creates this expectation that you don't need to do any work in order to convince anybody of anything. And I think that is just complete horseshit. So I really, really like parlay, basically, in Dungeon World. Actually, one of the coolest parlays I've ever seen. I mean, look, as most of these stories go, they usually involve Mr. Aaron Smith. We were playing, I don't even know what game we were playing. We were playing Dungeon World. But he was playing a cleric. And basically, like, Dungeon World doesn't really have, like, turn undead. Okay? But, like, they were in an encounter. There was a bunch of undead. And he had just like smashed, or like maybe he used like a blast from his holy symbol to like destroy one of the undead. And, it was kind of sweet, like the glowing holy symbol, and he, blast the undead. And he kind of like turned to me. He goes, Derek, do you think I have leverage over these undead? And I was like, absolutely you do. Because, you're holding a holy vessel of your God, and it's shining with divine radiance. And so he basically held the holy symbol up, and he was like, commanded them to, go back to the shadow, demons, and it was basically turn undead, but it resolved mechanically. And in the fiction, everybody agreed it was awesome, but it resolved as a parlay check. Because he was basically parlaying with them, and he had the ability to parlay with them in the middle of a combat with undead, but it's because he now had leverage. And the leverage was he was a living conduit of holy energy from his god. And he had just destroyed, a bunch of undead with his holy wrath. So it was really, really interesting. That was like one of the first times I played Dungeon World with that group. And I remember just thinking like, wow, the possibilities for this are just really, really, really cool. So, thank you. I mean, that was a nice little fun memory trip, but so thank you for that save versus. Appreciate it. Let's see here. Role playing is thinking in character, speaking in character, and acting in character. By that definition, I have never role played or played a role playing game ever. Let's see here. I mean, what you are describing, Beowulf, you are completely describing here the actor stance. You are making no conversations for author or director. If your paladin ignores their best mate dying on the floor to run across the room and be the first to get the shiny ruby worth 500 gold, please. That's not role playing. That's just being an idiot and ruining the game. I mean, is that the whole comment? Because see, this is how I think about it. Like, let me give you a great example. This happened at Gen Con. All right. Aaron had been running a game all day for like strangers, but one of my buddies was playing with him too. And he'd finally gotten some leather armor or something like that. And I made a character, like a fighter who was like, I don't know, maybe neutral good or something like that, or chaotic neutral, something like that. Wasn't evil. And we enter the dungeon, and I'm joining a little bit late. I had good stats, and we're going through the dungeon, and then something happened, and there was like a statue or something, and a demon got released, and the demon was like, bow before me, you pitiful mortals, or whatever like that. And I just like turned to Smith, and I drop to my knees, and I say, I pledge my eternal life to you, my lord. And Aaron's like, make a bluff check. I go, I'm not bluffing. And he is like, excellent. And he points to me and he goes, kill that one. And he points to another PC. And I go, okay. And so I go and I grappled him to death because he had a really high armor class, but he was a gnome. So he had a really shitty grapple check. And I grappled my friend and killed his character who he'd been playing all day. And he called me an asshole. But it was awesome. And the reason why I did that is because my stance there isn't to be an actor stance. I'm thinking about, like, I don't think of my character as being real. My character is, whatever my character does is what my character is. Does that make sense? So in that perspective, in that moment, what I wanted to see as a player was this betrayal. And I wanted to see this character pledge their life to the dark gods, because that's not what my character would do. Which character would ever make that choice? No, I did that. The reason I play role-playing games is because I want to see what's going to happen. So that's where that's the kind of way I play role-playing games. And so again, that is why I kind of say that against. That's not role-playing. It is role-playing. We're playing a role-playing game. It's role-playing. It's just not actor stance. Again, we've talked about this before on the channel, but there's director stance, there's author stance, and there's actor stance. So yeah. Because again, like in that situation, it's like, well, your character wasn't evil. It's like, well, he wasn't until that moment, and the power of the demon was thrust in front of him, and he gave in to his dark. It turns out he had actually grown up in a cult, and he'd always tried to avoid the call of the demon, but he was unable to resist. And now it's like, well, did you write that down in your backstory? It's like, dude, I don't have a backstory. Nothing my character does is true until I do it or until I say it. So that is my philosophy. It's also why I'm totally fine with there not being alignment. Let's see here. My chat is getting all messed up. I can't click on your thing because my teleprompter's messed up. Ikemo says, you neglected producer stance, which is whatever's best for the flow of the game. And sudden PvP tends to disintegrate the game real quick. Well, Ikemo, you're absolutely correct. Although I think that does kind of probably fall under director stance, but producer stance is a nice touch. I do like that. I will say this. It was a con game. It wasn't like our real game. I would behave differently if it wasn't a one-shot. I mean, who here doesn't play their characters differently in a one-shot? I think everybody. So at a con game, will I do that? Absolutely. That's a great opportunity for me to get to see that resolve. If I'm playing in like a long duration, long-term campaign, there are other considerations. Again, for me, what my character would do is one small, tiny component of what actions I'm actually going to take on my turn. So much of what I'm thinking about is the flow of the game, the pacing, what everybody else is, what would make for a good story, what would make for an interesting moment, what is going to create the most tension, the most drama. I'm doing this even as a player, not just as a GM, but as a player. I'm thinking of a way to escalate the situation. I'm thinking of a way to make it more extreme and intense. Or maybe I'm thinking of a way to bring it down and calm it down. I want a calmer moment. So again, what my character would do is such a small portion of what how I make decisions in a game like that. Let's see here. I like it. Full Metal Dragon says, yeah, that's not role playing. And then Unfortunate Pumpkin says, that's still role playing. Anand says, so more of a shadow than a Vorlon guy. Yeah, right. Exactly. He's more of a shadow than a Vorlon guy. Exactly. Let's see. High Desire says, it is role playing. It's not how I do it. I like actor stance, but it's still role playing. And that's generally speaking how I would agree with that as well. Ayla says, Ayla says, I'm an author at character creation. I'm authoring what my character is like. As soon as it hits the table, though, I'm an actor. Actor stance is the most fun for me as long as I'm writing my own script. Yeah, and I think actor stance is pretty boring. I actually hate it. And absolutely, Full Metal Dragon, we can agree to disagree. Right. High Desire says, your character is make-believe. You can't betray their truth. This works even in actor stance. I always play an actor stance, and I still make it up as I go along. High Desires, I think there's a lot of people in this chat, and there's definitely a lot of people in the play-by-post who would say that they disagree with you. They're like, no, my person's real. I know their thoughts and their feelings, and I know exactly what they would do, and I could never betray their truth. GM Scott says, in regular games, I play it like I stole it. You don't even want to see me in one-shots. And Kyle says, well, that's because you hate fun. Remember, we established this earlier. It's true. It's true. I do hate fun. And again, there's different boats to float. Pumpkin says, I'm definitely more author stance. I don't really get actor stance, but to each their own, Now, to be clear, the fun for me is explaining the motivation. So for example, like I said, again, it was a one shot, but whatever. But my fighter who betrayed, the party because the demon, mostly because I just wanted to see what would happen. I'm not going to just go, I do that. No, that's where me on the spot, Derek, and everyone will be like, what? And I'll be like, oh yeah. Didn't you know? My character grew up in a demon worshiping cult and he's been trying to do the right thing for so long. But they told him that one day the Dark Lord would come and demand service and he must obey. And this day has come. And it's like, really? And I was like, yeah, of course I'm making that up. But I'm motivating what I want to have happen by creating some bullshit. But that to me is just as valid as anything else. So, in fact, personally, I think it's more fun. I like playing with people like that. Now, again, as we talked about the producer stance, I mean, I cranked that up pretty high because it was a one shot at Gen Con, but sure. I mean, watch their root game. Watch how Aaron plays. Watch what Bob does. These guys are not making the decision that their character would make. They're making the decision that's going to lead to fun, interesting, crazy outcomes. And that is, to me, that's why I'm playing a role-playing game. Derek uses flashbacks to insert the role into what he's already played to make it a role-playing game. Maybe. Yeah. I mean, this is what I'm thinking, GM Scott. You know, whether you made it up before you play or you make it up on the spot, isn't it still just all made up? What makes one better than the other? It doesn't. In fact, and I think the other way of just making it up on the spot, you know, gives you a lot more freedom to make things much more, interesting and much more, that type of stuff. So to tie it back to a prior stream, what is fiction, mechanical or narrative first, going to help? What could define fun for those who may not know what they're looking for? Oh, that's a great question. Well, so for starters, fiction first gaming, in theory, fiction first gaming should be useful for people who want the world, the imaginary world that they're playing in, to make sense. If a game is if you are really, really concerned about the rules mattering and balance mattering, and if you don't want to get into a discussion with your GM about whether or not you can use your power or use your feat, then you probably don't want to do fiction first gaming, because fiction first gaming is going to frustrate you. Similarly, this is me, in a mechanic first game role playing, when you go, this is so stupid, that doesn't even make sense. Like I'm standing in front of the door. Why can't I just shoot it with my gun? People do this all the time in movies. I could do this. Derek, if I had a gun, I could shoot the lock. And it's like, well, you don't have the feet. If that really frustrates you, then you don't want to probably play a mechanical first game. Okay? Or you could play a mechanical first game. You could. And you could ignore the mechanics as you see fit at various times. And there's a lot of people, I think, who do play like that. I think very few people play Pathfinder 2 100% raw, but realize that it is, it's a gray area. It's a murky area. It's because it's going to be very unclear. In fact, usually the explanation goes something like this. Oh, we play Pathfinder 2. Oh, I completely ignore all the rules. Unless we're in combat, then I don't fuck around. That's how most people operate. Okay. I mean, if that works for you, that works for you. For me, I like a contiguous game experience. I like for combat and non-combat and everything else to work kind of the same. And so the idea that when I'm not in combat, I could come up with some cool bullshit thing and the GM will go, oh, that's totally a great idea. It works. Or they go, oh yeah, totally. I'm going to give you a massive bonus. I'm going to lower the DC because it makes total sense. But then when we get into combat, it's like, nope, it's fucking AC 27. It's the balanced combat encounter. Eyes is eyes. Take care, Glenn. Thank you for staying on so late. Appreciate the conversation and appreciate your viewpoint. So thanks for hanging out with us tonight. Really appreciate having you here. Thank you. I want rules to matter, just not balance. This is a great point. And I want the mechanics to be the vehicle by which characters interact with the fiction and the world in a way to. And I agree. And to me, that is Powered by the Apocalypse. Because remember, Powered by the Apocalypse, like the GM doesn't get to decide whether or not a move triggers, right? The rules do. The system does. You don't get to make a choice. That is very uninteresting to me. I want there to be, I want there to be this idea that like the rules do matter a lot in a PBTA game. Maybe they even matter more so because in a D20 game, there's this idea of like, oh, well, you can just rule 0, ignore the rule as you see fit, right? That's in all these games. It is not in Powered by the Apocalypse. It does not say you can ignore this rule. You must do what honesty demands. So that's one of the reasons why I really respect PBTA game. You can't weasel your way out of a role. My PC is an avatar and I control 100% of their motivation and emotions. Just feels boring to me at this point. And I agree. This is why I do like narrative mechanics. Maybe my PC is an ass and they let the paladin die, but I want that to be true in the fiction and I have a narrative mechanic to back it up. I think that's pretty reasonable. Let the dice make the hard decisions. That is basically where I kind of, run into it. Basically, it's the same. So yeah. Well, it's almost 10 o'clock. Wow, we did take a long time here. Appreciate hanging out with you guys. Probably gonna do a Sunday stream. This is like a because I don't think I have a lot going on this weekend. And I picked up a new game. It came while I was in Vegas. You ready for this? First look. It's still in the shrink wrap. I mean, I got a PDF, but I haven't opened it yet. All right. Is that cute animal creatures walking in a grassy field with herds of bumblebees? Now, so Easter Sunday, I don't have any plans. And Sunday. Also, who's doing anything Easter night? Nobody's doing anything Easter night. So probably Easter evening, I'm going to do a wander home first look. So this will be part of our ongoing stream of anthropomorphic animal games. And I'm really excited to dig into this one. It's very thick for what I expected for it. So we're probably going to take a look at that Sunday. I mean, there's always something that could happen. I got a sugar high just from the preview of that game. We'll be running zombie scenarios to celebrate Easter. Well, you know what? To each their own. Yeah. As we kind of wrap up here, though, Anon does have a really cool point here. I stopped playing mechanics-first RPGs as too often I was punished for following the rules when it didn't fit the fiction in the GM's head, which they did not do a good job of conveying. And again, that's where we can run into these, hurt feelings, and why some people don't like fiction first is because, the player's like, well, I took this ability to use it, and the GM's like, well, it doesn't feel like it's appropriate in this position, And yes, as written, I do feel like Pendragon is a good example of the mechanics informing your role playing, and that idea of the traits and the passions I think is really, really, really interesting. And that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in the game. Ben loves him some anthropomorphic animal RPGs. He's the one that recommended it to me. I mean, I think Pendragon has a lot to offer. I mean, again, the new edition is coming out soon, so maybe the starter set's okay, but I mean, I might wait till the new edition, comes out. Yeah. Is Wander Home if Root matches its art rather than its mechanics? Yes. Casey. A pastoral fantasy tabletop role-playing game set forth into a world of grassy fields, mossy shrines, herds of bumblebees, rabbits in sundresses, geckos with suspenders, starry night skies, and the most beautiful sunsets you can imagine. We will befriend stag beetles the size of houses, argue with the king of the floating mountain, fall in love in the basket of a hot air balloon up beneath clouds, and go on a journey with some of the most amazing people you could ask for. Where will we go? What will we see? We'll have to find out together. Will you join me? That is how that game is described. He also recommended Root. That's true, and he does love Mouse Guard, and I love Mouse. I've owned Mouse Guard for a very, very long time. See, Beowulf. Come on, Beowulf. Think about how much you could role play that gecko in suspenders. I think that'd be a real challenge. I think you'd enjoy it. Geckos should have been salamanders and suspenders. Missed opportunity. Yeah, Wander Home is post-apocalypse Root. Pepper says, I know a group that would love this. I might run it for them. Well, couple of things. Number one, recommended by Ben. Number two, right, Ryutama, right, was like that, the infamous Ryutama stream was Derek came in being like, this is shit. And then I started reading it, and I was like, okay, you know what? I can kind of see that. I could see where I get where this could be kind of cool. And I'm like starting to get into it. And then the Ryujin shit hit, and I was like, oh my God, this is so stupid. So this is me taking another shot at sort of pastoral wandering RPGs. It's not. Look, the reason why I know what I know and the reason why I can talk about what I can talk about is I don't just pick up games that are the ones, I try to avoid the echo chamber. I try to get new games into my blood. I try to get new games into my collection because, that the exposure is what enables me to have the perspective and the viewpoint that I do. By the way, if anyone is interested, we are putting together a week of gaming to celebrate Japan starting April 29th in the KLC community games, meaning through the Patreon. Pumpkin, is there any particular reason why we're doing that? Josh says, I think Skate Wizards is more my style. Nice, Josh. I still want you to pick that up, Josh, so you can tell us about the game. GM Scott, see, look, there's always something that can bring people together. For once, I agree with you, Beowulf. That sounds horrible. Do we think we'll have a Ryu-Tama Ryu-Pete? I don't know. Remains to be seen. I don't think so. Golden Week. I don't know that I know what that is. My coworkers keep asking me to run the game for them. Despite that sounding gross, it might work well for a Corpo week. It's Japan. Okay, it's Golden Week's a Japan thing. Okay. Well, we don't get the whole week off. Okay. So, all right. Anyways, how convenient for them. It's like their Christmas kind of, right? I know most people only get 2 days off for Christmas, but a lot of people end up taking the whole thing off of it. Interesting. Maybe I'll do like a Legend of the Five Rings stream that day. We haven't had one of those in a while. I can wax poetically about that. By the way, the last thing that I'm going to do before I dip out is, if you haven't been following along on the Knights of Last Call's Patreon and Twitter, we are down to our final four for March Madness. There is, and you can go to our Twitter if you're not a member of our Patreon, although you should be a member of our Patreon if you're watching this after 3 hours, honestly. We've got 4 games. We've got Blades in the Dark versus Dragonbane for a spot in the finals, right? So we've got the sort of one of the most elegant versions of Powered by the Apocalypse, so much so that it created its own version, versus the new hotness of Free League's Dragonbane, which has just swept our Patreon and a lot of other games, a lot of other players, gaming channels. I know that Indestructiboy is making a bunch of Dragonbane content now. And then in the other bracket, we have the other Free League darling, Forbidden Lands, which of course is the game that the Knights of Last Call are currently playing in our Friday games, and Fabula Ultima, which is one of our favorite games of all time. So these are really tough votes. These are just really, really tough votes for me. I think honestly any of these could win, and I think I would be fine with it. I'm not going to say if I had to pick, if I had to pick one, which one it would be. Now, one thing that is interesting here is, maybe I'll do a stream about this. Maybe I'll bring Bob on, but to talk about how these games are similar in some ways and different in other games, like which games we'll probably talk about, like the Elite Eight as well. It's interesting what games have advanced and how Twitter voted differently from the Discord. It is in the polls channel in the general chat. Am I still live? Am I making up for lost time? A little bit. Okay, you found it. No, 13th Age got taken out by I think 13th Age got taken out by Dungeon World, I think. No, 13th Age got taken out by Forbidden Lands. It got taken out by Forbidden Lands, yeah. Now, it's I don't know. Again, I don't want to give everybody, things, but yes, I am making up for lost time. Oh, by the way, Steven, since you're here, I checked, and I got to talk to Bob, but yeah, the game is Tuesday. I have the hotel Wednesday, so I'm hoping that we can leave like Wednesday, maybe around like in the morning, but not like super early, but like for Origins. So, Yeah, rookie numbers. I mean, it's been a long time since we had like a 5 or 6 hour stream. But in any case, so go to Twitter, get your vote in, or if you're a member of the Patreon, or you can join the Patreon, you can go get your vote in. But I do think it's kind of interesting, that these are the 4 games that have kind of bubbled to the top. And don't get me wrong, some of these are definitely, because like Dragonbane is more of a Bob thing than me. I mean, he's been running the game for community members for the last couple months. He ran me through the game. I have never even run it. So I think the game's great and all, but it's interesting because it's like not something that I've really hyped up so much. It's more of a Bob thing. And then obviously I think Forbidden Lands is great. Although again, I do have some problems with the Year Zero engine, and I've talked about those on stream. And then you have Fabula Ultima, which is a game that I pretty much don't have any problems with. And I think it's a wonderful, amazing game, and it won a bunch of awards last year. So obviously it's really great. And then there's Blades in the Dark, though, which is just, to me, it's like one of the seminal works of RPG philosophy, and John Harper's a genius. So it's a really, really tough Final Four. Hopefully the real Final Four is this interesting. All right. Well, like I said, Easter Sunday. Hopefully everybody has a good holiday weekend, if that's your thing that you do. Otherwise, I'm pretty much planning on being on Sunday to do a wander home first look. We'll look forward from there. We've got a couple more weeks left in the studio, probably only 1 or 2 more streams. And then we'll probably have a private teardown stream just for the patrons. As we kind of get ready, and I have to take everything apart and ship it out. But again, if you have any questions, again, remember, we said definitions aren't really important. What's important is that you are thinking about what kind of play pattern works for you and works for your group, and what kind of, aspects do you enjoy, and how can you learn from that and understand what you're doing and how that leads to good results for you and your players, or bad results for you and your players. And if you have any questions about it, you know where to hit me up. The KOLC Patreon Discord, accessible to all of our Patreon members. Feel free to start a conversation, ping me, pull me into the conversation, ask me a question. That's what we do. I work from home, so I'm a data scientist. I've got some downtime during the day. Code has to run, and databases have to be updated. So I'm always I'm on there a pretty fair amount, and I go to bed real late. So, there's always an opportunity for more conversation. It doesn't just end with the stream. So I look forward to seeing some of you, all of you, most of you there, and we'll catch you next time on Knights of Last Call. Peace.